Hi everyone, welcome back to Mr. Night Scare's story. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from if you're enjoying the stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. The Silent Witness. It was supposed to be a normal night. Emily Carter, a 28-year-old investigative journalist, went for her usual evening jog in Green Lake Park, Seattle. It was a crisp October evening. The air smelled of rain, and the last few joggers were heading home. Emily wasn't supposed to be one of them. When she didn't return, her roommate filed a police report. No leads, no body, no signs of struggle. Then, 2 days later, her phone was discovered. Under a park bench, screen cracked, still recording. The police retrieved the audio, expecting wind and background noise. But what they heard was something that would send chills down their spines. At 1:43 a.m., a faint whisper broke through the static. You shouldn't have looked. But here's the thing. Emily was alone when she disappeared. Or at least she should have been. Emily wasn't just any journalist. She had been working on something big. An exposé on Horizon Technologies, a Seattle-based defense contractor specializing in artificial intelligence and surveillance. Her best friend, fellow reporter Mark Holloway, was the last person she had called before she vanished. Now, staring at her notes, which he found hidden in the lining of her couch, Mark felt a growing sense of dread. Horizon Technologies isn't tracking criminals. They're choosing who disappears. Then another scrawled in the margins. If you hear the whisper, it's already too late. Mark's blood ran cold. Was Emily still out there? Or had she uncovered something that didn't want to be found? Mark began retracing Emily's steps. He found one frame of erased security footage, a black SUV near Green Lake Park at the time she disappeared. The license plate was unregistered, but with some digging, Mark linked it to a name, Daniel Rhodes, former CIA Black Ops, now head of risk management at Horizon Technologies, a man who made people disappear. Mark confronted him at a crowded coffee shop. I just want to know what happened to Emily, he said. Rhodes smiled, stirred his coffee. Emily Carter looked too hard at things she shouldn't have. Now she's gone. I suggest you avoid the same mistake. That night, Mark returned home to find his apartment trashed. His laptop destroyed, notebooks burned, and taped to his bathroom mirror. Sticky note, in Emily's handwriting. Stop now. Mark sent Emily's last recording to Dr. Rachel Lynn, a sound analyst at the University of Washington. 3 hours later, she called. Panicked. Mark, that voice in the recording? The whisper. It's not Emily's. It's yours. Mark froze. That's impossible, he whispered. I know, Rachel said. And that's not all. I isolated the background noise and found something else. A mechanical sound. A drone. Not just any drone. A model that didn't officially exist. Mark followed Emily's last lead. An abandoned Horizon Technologies lab on the outskirts of the city. The building was empty. No security. No cameras. Just dust and silence. Then he found the basement. Rows of people strapped to chairs, their heads covered in black neural devices. Breathing but motionless. And in the last row, Emily. She looked alive, but her eyes weren't seeing. Mark rushed to her side, shaking her. Emily, it's me. I'm getting you out of here. Her lips trembled. She mouthed something, but there was no sound. Then, over a hidden speaker, a voice crackled through. Welcome, Mr. Holloway. You were never supposed to hear yourself. The lights cut out, and the recording ends. Weeks later, another journalist, James Cole, started investigating the disappearance of both Emily Carter and Mark Holloway. One morning, he received a package. No return address. No fingerprints. Inside, a burner phone. Contained a single audio file. Static. Then a whisper. You shouldn't have looked. Underneath it, James heard his own voice. If Mark was never there, how was his voice on the recording? Was he investigating his own disappearance before it happened? Or had he already been erased, rewritten, trapped in the very system he tried to expose? The silent witness never lies. But sometimes, It speaks before you're ready to listen. Story number 2. The Disappearing Door. The Sunridge Motel sat just off the highway in a quiet stretch of Arizona desert. It wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap, perfect for travelers passing through. For years, nothing strange had ever happened there. Until 6 months ago. That's when people started disappearing. It was always the same room, 773. Guests would check in for a night. Their luggage would be found untouched the next morning. The door would still be locked from the inside. And yet they were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. The first disappearance was Daniel Reeves, a 32-year-old salesman. He had checked into room 773 after his car broke down nearby. The next morning, housekeeping knocked on his door. No answer. When they unlocked the room, they found his clothes folded on the bed, his phone charging on the nightstand, his wallet on the desk. The only thing missing was him. The police were called, but the case made no sense. The security cameras showed Daniel entering the room. The door never opened again after that. The windows were sealed shut. There was no way out. Daniel Reeves had vanished into thin air. Over the next 3 months, more people disappeared from room 773. A truck driver on his way to California, a travel blogger live streaming her trip, a retired teacher visiting family, a detective investigating the disappearances. Each time, the same eerie pattern. They were seen entering the room. The door never opened again. They simply ceased to exist. And then came the strangest case yet. A motel worker named Lena Vargas was cleaning rooms the night the detective vanished. She swore she heard something, a faint whisper, coming from inside room 773. But here's the thing. No one was in the room. And the words she heard? Not yet. Soon. Terrified, she quit her job that night. But her testimony left the police with more questions than answers. Who was whispering in an empty room? Desperate for answers, paranormal investigator Ethan Cross decided to check into room 773 himself. He brought heavy checkmark infrared cameras, heavy checkmark motion sensors, heavy checkmark a live streaming setup. Thousands of viewers tuned in to watch him spend the night. For 4 hours, nothing happened. Then, at 3:17 a.m., Ethan started acting strange. He stood up. He stared at the door. His eyes widened. Then he whispered into the camera. It's here. The live stream glitched. Static. Distortion. The sound of something moving, something slithering. Then silence. When the feed returned, Ethan was gone. His equipment, still there. The door, still locked from the inside. The cameras never stopped recording, yet somehow he had vanished. A forensic expert examined Ethan's footage. At 3:16 a.m., he was in the room. At 3:17 a.m., he whispered, "It's here." At 3:18 a.m., the screen flickered, and for a single frame, something appeared. A door that shouldn't be there. Not the entrance, not the bathroom, the third door. But before anyone could react, it was gone. A week later, a family checked into room 302 on the opposite side of the motel. That night, the father woke up to find his wife standing in the corner, facing the wall. She was whispering, "Not yet. Soon." Terrified, he turned on the lights, and there, on the far wall, was a door that had never been there before. When he blinked, it was gone. And the next morning, his wife had vanished. The motel owner, Carl Bennett, suddenly shut down the business. But why? A journalist uncovered a disturbing detail in the motel's history. The land where Sunridge Motel was built? It used to be a burial site, a mass grave, from an unrecorded tragedy over a century ago. And the name of the old town that once stood there? Hollow Door. Chapter 9, The Motel That Moves. A few months later, a new motel opened in a different city, different name, different location, but inside, one specific room number. And sometimes, when the lights are low, people see a door where one shouldn't be, a door that only some can see. And once you open it, you never come back. The last known person to investigate Sunridge Motel was a journalist named Alex Carter. A year later, his brother received a package. Inside was a burner phone, contained one audio file, a faint whisper crackling through the static. Not yet. Soon. And underneath it, Alex's voice. But Alex Carter had been missing for over a year. What happens if you see the door? They say the motel still appears, changing names, changing cities. And if you ever book a room and wake up to find a door that wasn't there before, don't open it. Because once you do, you'll be the next one to disappear. And soon, someone else will hear your voice whispering, "Not yet. Soon." Story number 3. The last broadcast. It was 2:13 a.m. when Jake Nolan, a long-haul trucker, heard the station for the first time. He was driving through a deserted stretch of West Virginia, his only company the steady hum of his tires on the road and the crackling voice of a late-night radio host. Only he hadn't tuned in to any station. The radio turned on by itself. Welcome back, night owls. This is 104.6 FM, The Echo, bringing you songs for the lost and the lonely. Jake frowned. 104.6 FM didn't exist. He turned the dial, but the signal wouldn't go away. It was crystal clear. Then, the DJ's voice dropped to a whisper. Tonight, we have a dedication. This one's for Jake Nolan. His heart slammed against his ribs. How the hell did the station know his name? Then the song began to play. It wasn't music. It was a recording of his own voice. If you're hearing this, it's already too late. Then static. The station was gone. Jake drove faster. Jake wasn't the only one who had heard station 104.6. 2 weeks earlier, Lisa Monroe, a journalist from Charleston, had been researching a missing DJ, Charlie Graves, the former host of a midnight radio show. Charlie had disappeared 5 years ago, live on air. His final words were recorded. "Something's in the booth with me. I think it's watching. Oh God, the lights are flickering. If anyone's listening, please..." Silence. Then a whisper. "We'll be right back after this." The station never aired again. Charlie Graves was never seen again, until Lisa received a voicemail. From his number, Lisa played the message. It was distorted, crackling like an old radio. Then Charlie's voice. "Lisa, if you're hearing this, you need to stop looking. They know. They're in the static. They're in the silence. Whatever you do, don't answer when they call. And for God's sake, don't turn on 104.6 FM. Then a whisper. Not Charlie's voice, but hers. "But Lisa..." "You already did." Lisa's hands shook. The message had used her own voice. Lisa traced the origins of station 104.6 to a defunct radio tower outside the abandoned town of Red Pines. The station had burned down decades ago, yet somehow it was still broadcasting. She drove out to the ruins at midnight, carrying a portable radio. At exactly 12 a.m., the signal returned. "Welcome back, night owls. Lisa Monroe. We've been waiting for you." She dropped the radio. The voice on the broadcast was hers. Inside the burned-down station, Lisa found a dust-covered cassette recorder. One last tape. She pressed play. It was Charlie Graves. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. The station isn't a station. It's a signal, a living thing. It doesn't play music, it plays people, pulls them in, and keeps broadcasting them forever. Every time someone listens, it gets stronger. It learns your voice. It learns your name. And once you hear yourself on the air, you're next." Lisa's breath hitched. The tape stopped. Then, over the static, "We'll be right back after this." And in the silence, she heard breathing. Right behind her, Lisa ran. She never spoke about what happened that night. But 2 weeks later, station 104.6 returned. And its new DJ? A familiar voice. "Welcome back, night owls. This is Lisa Monroe. And I'll be with you forever." The last thing ever heard on 104.6 FM before it disappeared again? A whisper. "Turn it up. We're talking about you next." Jake Nolan couldn't stop thinking about the radio message with his own voice. He became obsessed. He researched every case. The missing DJs, the strange broadcasts, the people who heard their own voices before disappearing. That's when he found Lisa Monroe's name and her final recording. If you're hearing this, you need to stop listening, but Jake didn't, because at exactly 2:13 a.m., his radio turned on, and a voice, his own voice, spoke. "Welcome back, Jake Nolan. We've been waiting for you." People say if you're driving alone at night and your radio starts playing a station that doesn't exist, don't listen, because if you hear your own voice on the air, you'll be the next broadcast. And somewhere out there, in the dead of night, the signal still whispers, "Welcome back, night owls. We've been waiting for you." Some say the station moves, jumping from city to city. Others say it's growing, spreading through phones, computers, even satellite signals. But one thing is certain. If you ever hear a voice on the radio saying, "We'll be right back," after this, turn it off, because the next voice you hear might be your own. Story number 4. The House That Calls Your Name. It started with a letter. Ethan Caldwell, a real estate photographer, found it in his mailbox. An envelope with no return address, no stamp, nothing. Just his name, typed neatly in the center. Inside was a business card. It read, "For sale, 23 Ashford Lane." That was strange. Ethan had lived in this city his entire life. He knew every street, every neighborhood, and there was no Ashford Lane. Yet, when he entered the address into his GPS, it gave him directions. Even stranger, the estimated arrival time read, midnight, as if the house was already there, waiting. Ethan followed the GPS. He drove past familiar streets, past places he had seen 1,000 times, until suddenly he wasn't. The road had changed. Tall, dead trees lined the street. The pavement was cracked, as if no one had driven on it for years. And then he saw it, a massive Victorian house, standing alone beneath a sky that had turned a sickly shade of gray. 23 Ashford Lane. Something about it felt wrong, like the house was watching him. Ethan pulled out his camera, but when he tried to take a picture, the house wasn't in the frame. His car was, the trees were, but where the house should have been, only empty land. Ethan stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and something rotten. The wallpaper curled at the edges. The floor creaked beneath his feet. He walked down the hallway, photographing each room. Living room, kitchen, a study filled with old books in languages he couldn't read. Then suddenly, he was standing in a room he didn't remember entering. A single chair sat in the middle, and on the wall was a mirror, a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror that seemed too clean for a house this old. That's when he saw it, his own reflection, and behind him, something else, something watching him. Ethan spun around. Nothing was there, just the empty room, just the mirror. But then he heard it, a whisper, coming from the glass. Ethan Caldwell, his own name, spoken in a voice that wasn't his. His breath caught. The mirror fogged up, as if something was breathing on the other side. Then slowly, a handprint appeared, not his own. Someone or something was on the other side, watching, waiting. Chapter 5. The door that shouldn't open. Ethan ran. He reached the front door and stopped because the house had changed. The hallway was longer than before. The walls were closer, and the door, it wasn't there anymore. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. Then behind him, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. He didn't turn around. He ran through the twisting hallways. Every door led to another corridor. Every staircase curved back to where he started. And then, he was back in front of the mirror. But this time, his reflection was gone. Ethan's phone rang. His hands were shaking as he pulled it from his pocket. No caller ID, but something told him he had to answer. He pressed accept, and a voice whispered through the speaker, "You shouldn't have come here." The line went dead. Then, a new notification appeared on his phone. A photo of him, standing in the mirror, with something behind him, something that had no face. Ethan ran until his legs burned. Every hallway twisted into another. Every door led to the same mirror. and every time he looked into it, the figure behind him got closer, until finally, a new door appeared, one that hadn't been there before. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle, and the house screamed. Chapter 8: The House That Disappeared. Ethan woke up in his car. The sun was rising. The street was empty. 23 Ashford Lane was gone. No house, no road, just an overgrown lot. His camera was still in the passenger seat. He grabbed it, flipping through the pictures. The house wasn't in any of them, but the last photo made his stomach drop. It was a picture of himself, standing in front of a mirror, and behind him, the figure, but this time, it had a face, his face, and its lips were moving, whispering, "See you soon." Ethan moved to another city, got rid of his camera, stopped answering unknown numbers. But then last night, he got another letter, another business card. It read, "For sale, 23 Ashford Lane." But this time, the address was his own. He stepped outside, and at the end of his street, there it was, the house, waiting. People say if you ever receive a letter with no return address, don't open it. Because if you read the words, "For sale, 23 Ashford Lane," it means the house has chosen you. And once you step inside, it never lets you go. Story number 5. The Last Passenger. It started with a ticket. Daniel Reeves, a private investigator, found it on his desk when he returned to his office. A single train ticket printed on old, yellowed paper. There was no sender, no note, nothing to explain who had left it there. It read, "Departure, Grand Central Station, 11:45 p.m. Destination, unknown. Seat, last carriage, last seat." The strangest part? Daniel had never seen a ticket like this before. The date on it? February 29th, 1924. That was impossible. Curiosity got the better of him. That night, at 11:30 p.m., Daniel arrived at Grand Central Station. He searched the departure board. There was no 11:45 p.m. train. And yet, as the clock struck 11:45, a loud whistle echoed through the station. A train, shrouded in steam and darkness, rolled onto the platform. It was ancient, a 1920s locomotive, its black metal exterior covered in dust and rust. Yet it was perfectly functional. The doors hissed open. No conductors, no passengers stepping off. Just an empty train, waiting for him. Daniel hesitated, then stepped inside. The train was freezing cold. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows. The seats were covered in dust, as if no one had sat in them for decades. He walked through the carriages, empty, all except for the last one. In the final carriage, sitting in the last seat, was a man in a dark suit and hat. His face was hidden in shadow, and on the table in front of him was a single glass of whiskey, untouched. Daniel sat across from him. "Who are you?" he asked. The man slowly lifted his head, and Daniel froze, because he recognized the face. It was his own. The man smiled. "Took you long enough." His voice was identical to Daniel's. His eyes, his features, even the small scar on his chin. Everything was the same. "This isn't possible," Daniel whispered. The man took a slow sip of whiskey. "Neither is this train." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What is this? Some kind of trick?" The man laughed. "No trick. Just a second chance." "A second chance at what?" The man leaned closer. "At getting off this train before it's too late." Then he slid something across the table. A newspaper. Daniel picked it up. The headline made his stomach drop. "Private Investigator Daniel Reeves Found Dead on Train. Unsolved Mystery Continues." The date? March 1st, 1924. The train lurched forward. Daniel jumped up, but the doors had locked. The man, his double, smiled sadly. "It's starting." The train shuddered, and suddenly Daniel was no longer alone. The seats around him were now full of passengers. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothing from different time periods, the 1800s, the 1950s, the 2000s. Their faces were pale and sunken, their eyes dark with fear. and all at once they turned to look at him. Then they started whispering, "You shouldn't be here. He's coming. Get off the train." Daniel's heart pounded. "Who's coming?" he asked. They didn't answer, because suddenly the lights went out, and the train screamed. A heavy thump echoed through the carriage. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. The passengers fell silent. Then, one by one, they began to disappear. Their bodies faded, as if being erased from existence, until only Daniel remained. And then he saw it. At the far end of the carriage, a figure in black, tall, motionless, watching him. A conductor's hat sat atop his featureless face, because he had no face, just a void, and in his gloved hand, a list, names written in fading ink. Daniel leaned forward, his breath catching. At the very bottom of the list, his own name was vanishing. The train sped up, rattling violently. The faceless conductor took a step forward. Daniel backed away. His double, his past self, grabbed his wrist. "Listen to me," he hissed. "You have one chance to get off this train." "How?" Daniel demanded. His double handed him a watch, an old pocket watch, frozen at 11:45 p.m. "Break it," he said. "Why?" "Because that's when it all started." Daniel hesitated. Then the conductor raised his hand. The lights flickered violently, and the world began to disappear. Daniel smashed the watch against the table. The glass shattered, and time snapped backward. The train lurched to a stop. The conductor let out a soundless scream, and everything went black. Chapter 9. The Ticket That Never Was. Daniel gasped, and found himself standing back in Grand Central Station. The train was gone. The ticket? Nowhere to be found. He checked his watch. 11:44 p.m. The train had never come. Had it all been a dream? But then, something cold touched his fingers. He looked down. In his palm was a single train ticket, the ink fading fast. He turned it over, and on the back, written in his own handwriting, "Never board the 11:45 train." Then, before his eyes, the ticket disappeared. Final twist. The train is still running. The midnight train still exists. No records, no schedules, no conductors. But if you ever find a yellowed train ticket on your desk, and if it reads, "Last carriage, last seat," whatever you do, don't get on. Because once you board, you never get off. Story number 6. The Silent Witness. Ethan Cole was used to receiving disturbing emails. As an investigative journalist for the New York Truth, he had spent the last 5 years covering high-profile crimes, corporate conspiracies, and political scandals. But the email he received at 3:17 a.m. on a cold January night was different. There was no subject line, no text, just a single attachment, a video file labeled "Do Not Open." Ethan hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to ignore it, but his curiosity won. He clicked play. The video was grainy, the footage seemingly recorded from a hidden camera. A woman in her late 20s sat tied to a chair in a dimly lit apartment. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes wide with terror. Then a figure entered the frame. A tall man, dressed in all black, wearing a featureless white mask. He walked toward her, kneeling down to whisper something in her ear. Her face crumpled in horror. She shook her head violently. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his gloved hands around her throat and squeezed. Ethan's pulse pounded as he watched the life drain from the woman's eyes. The camera angle shifted slightly, revealing something chilling. A black serpent tattoo on the man's wrist. But then Ethan noticed something even more disturbing. The timestamp on the video? 3 days in the future. The investigation begins. At first, Ethan assumed it was a hoax, a sick prank. But something about the video felt too real. His gut told him to dig deeper. He extracted the metadata from the file, tracking its origin to an encrypted server. No traceable IP address. Whoever sent this didn't want to be found. The background in the video, a luxury apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, seemed familiar. Ethan cross-referenced New York's high-end properties and found a match. The Skylark Towers, a new residential skyscraper downtown. There was just one problem. The apartment in the video didn't exist. According to the building's records, there was no unit with that number. It had never been sold, never been leased. It was as if it had been erased from reality. A name without a past. Ethan needed to find the woman in the video. He took a screenshot of her face and ran it through missing person databases. After hours of searching, he found a match. Lila Montgomery, a schoolteacher who had been reported missing 5 hours ago. Panic gripped him. If the video was real, she only had 3 days left. He found Lila's address and rushed there, hoping to warn her. But when he arrived at her apartment, the door was slightly open. Inside, the place was ransacked. Papers scattered, furniture overturned. Lila was gone. A single message was scrawled on the wall in red paint. "Stop looking." Desperate, Ethan checked police reports the next day. There was no mention of Lila's disappearance. In fact, her name was gone from all records. Her driver's license, work history, even her social media erased, as if she had never existed. Ethan tried to contact her family, but when he called her mother's phone, a robotic voice responded. "The number you are trying to reach does not exist." Something was very wrong. The black serpents. Ethan remembered the tattoo on the killer's wrist. It wasn't just a random design. It was a black serpent coiled around a dagger, the symbol of a secretive group he had encountered years ago. 5 years earlier, he had investigated a series of disappearances linked to a shadowy organization known as the Black Serpents. They were rumored to be involved in human experiments, deepfake technology, and digital erasure. But before Ethan could publish his findings, his sources vanished. His editor killed the story. He had been warned to drop it, and he had, until now. He dug through old files, piecing together what little evidence remained. The Black Serpents didn't just kill people, they erased them. They controlled records, manipulated digital footprints, and used advanced AI-generated deepfake technology to rewrite history. They could make real people disappear while fabricating new ones to take their place. Ethan was terrified. If they had Lila, it was already too late. The trap. That night, Ethan received another email. No text, no sender, just a new video. He played it and his blood ran cold. It showed himself, tied to the same chair, in the same apartment where Lila had been killed. The timestamp? 48 hours from now. Ethan realized too late they knew he was watching. A floorboard creaked behind him. Before he could turn around, a cloth pressed against his face. The world faded to black. Ethan woke up in a dark room, tied to a chair. His head throbbed. A figure stepped into the light. It was the masked killer. Except this time, he wasn't wearing a mask. It was Ethan. Perfect copy of him. Same face, same voice. The doppelganger smirked. "You've been asking too many questions, Ethan." Panic surged through him. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm your replacement." The clone leaned closer. "And in 24 hours, I'll be living your life." Ethan struggled, but the ropes were too tight. The clone lifted a syringe. "Don't worry. When this is over, no one will remember you existed." The needle plunged into Ethan's neck. Darkness swallowed him. The legacy lives on. The next morning, every news channel reported. Journalist Ethan Cole commits suicide after battling mental illness. His social media was scrubbed. His articles deleted. The world moved on. But then, 1 week later, thousands of people received an anonymous email. A single video file. The footage of Ethan's murder. The Black Serpents had failed to erase him completely. And somewhere, in the depths of the dark web, a new name emerged. Silent_witness. Ethan was gone, but the fight had only just begun. Story number 7. The Whispering Man. At exactly 2:06 a.m., Detective Sam Carter's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It belonged to a man who had been dead for 7 years. "Carter, he's coming for you. You have 3 days." The line went dead. Sam stared at his phone, his blood turning to ice. He knew that voice. It belonged to Daniel Reeves, a convicted serial killer, one who had died in the electric chair in 2018. A murder that shouldn't exist. Sam had been the lead detective on the Reeves case. The man had murdered 13 people, all in the same gruesome way. Throats slit, lips sewn shut, and a cryptic message carved into their skin. He hears everything. Reeves had never revealed why he did it, who he was, or why the murders had suddenly stopped after 13 victims. He went to his grave laughing. So why the hell was he calling now? A cold sweat formed on Sam's back. He tried to rationalize it. Someone was playing a sick joke, a voice imitation, something. But then his phone dinged with a new message. It was a picture, a fresh crime scene, a body murdered in the exact same way as Reeves' victims. The timestamp? 20 minutes ago. Sam raced to the location in the photo, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The second he stepped inside, his stomach twisted. It was real. The victim, a young woman, was slumped against the wall, her lips sewn shut with black thread, her throat cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated, and carved into her bare chest, just like before. He hears everything. The problem? The crime scene was identical to Reeves' previous murders. Same tools, same precision. Perfect replica, except for one horrifying detail. The victim's phone was still in her hand, screen cracked, her last outgoing call made to Sam's number. The call that had woken him up. Sam called for backup. The forensics team confirmed the impossible. The DNA at the scene was a perfect match to Daniel Reeves. How could that be? Reeves was dead. Sam had watched him fry in the electric chair himself. Then the lab called with another disturbing detail. The victim? Her fingerprints didn't exist in any government database. No ID. No social security number. No history. As if she had never been born. The hunt for the whispering man. Sam became obsessed. He went through old files, rewatching interrogation footage of Reeves before his execution. One part stood out. The final interview the day before his death. "You think this is over, detective?" Reeves had sneered. "You don't get it, do you? I was never the one in control." "Then who was?" Sam had asked. Reeves had leaned forward, whispering something so softly that the microphone barely picked it up. Sam replayed the tape, enhancing the audio. He hears everything. A chill ran down Sam's spine. Who the hell was he? And why did it feel like he was still watching? The whispering man makes himself known. The next night, another call came. Sam answered, gripping the phone tightly. This time, the voice was not Reeves. It was something else. Something hollow. Something wrong. 3 days, Sam. The voice was barely a whisper, crawling through the speaker like a breeze through dead trees. You should never have looked for me. Then the line cut to static and something else. In the background, hidden beneath the noise, was the sound of breathing. Heavy, ragged, right behind him. Sam spun around, gun raised, but the room was empty. Sam didn't sleep. By the third night, he felt like he was losing his mind. Then, at exactly 2:06 a.m., he heard it. A whisper, not from his phone, from inside his apartment. He turned slowly, and there, standing in the shadows of his living room, was a man, tall, gaunt, his skin pale as a corpse, his lips sewn shut with black thread. His eyes were missing, replaced by gaping black holes. And in his hand, a phone with the screen still glowing. The call had never been coming from a number. It had been coming from him. Sam raised his gun, but the whispering man lifted a single finger to where his lips should be. A warning. Shoo! Then, darkness. When Sam woke up, he was in his bed, as if nothing had happened. His gun was still on his nightstand. His apartment was untouched. Had it been a dream? But then his phone rang. The caller ID? His own number. Hands shaking, Sam answered. A whisper slid through the speaker. You belong to me now. The line went dead. And in the mirror across the room, Sam saw his own reflection smiling back at him with lips sewn shut. Story number 8. The Red Room livestream. At exactly 11:59 p.m., a new livestream appeared on the dark web. The title? The last show you'll ever see. No host. No description. Just a countdown ticking from 60 seconds. Thousands of users joined, drawn by the rumors. Some said it was just another hoax. Others whispered that it was a real red room, an underground broadcast where people were tortured and murdered for entertainment. When the countdown hit 0, the screen flickered. A woman sat in a chair, tied and gagged. Her wide, terrified eyes stared directly into the camera. Then a robotic voice spoke. "One of you will decide her fate." And in the chat box, a poll appeared. Kill or set free. The timer began counting down from 60 seconds. Most of the viewers thought it was fake. A game, a sick prank, until the woman started screaming. A deadly game begins. Luke Harris, a cybersecurity expert, had spent years tracking down illegal dark web activity. He had seen horrifying things, black market organ sales, human trafficking rings, but this was different. This was interactive murder. He scanned the chat as it exploded with reactions. Anonymous_45. WTF is this? Killer Queen. Fake AF. XX Dark Lords X. Oh well, let's kill her. Luke's heart pounded. If this was real, he couldn't just watch. He traced the live stream's IP address, but it bounced across multiple countries, completely untraceable. Whoever was running this knew what they were doing. Then the poll closed. Kill, 87%. The robotic voice spoke again. Majority has decided. A hooded figure stepped into frame, holding a knife. The woman shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. Luke slammed his laptop shut. He couldn't watch. But then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Why did you look away, Luke? His blood turned to ice. They knew he was watching. The next victim. The Red Room livestream didn't stop. Each night at 11:59 p.m., a new victim appeared. A new poll. A new execution. Luke tried everything, hacking into the site, tracking users, alerting authorities. But every time, the stream vanished before the police could act. Then, on the 7th night, something changed. There was no new victim. Instead, the camera showed a live feed of Luke's apartment. His own face appeared on the screen, and below it, poll. Kill, 50%. Spare, 50%. The timer started counting down. 60 seconds. Luke's breath came fast and shallow. This wasn't just a twisted game. They were coming for him. The truth behind the Red Room. Luke didn't wait. He grabbed his gun and ran, smashing his laptop before disappearing into the night. He had one last chance, his only lead. A name buried deep in the dark web's most secretive forums. The Puppet Master, the rumored mastermind behind the Red Room. Luke followed a trail of encrypted messages, eventually tracking them to a hidden underground bunker in an abandoned industrial park. What he found inside made his stomach turn. Rows of monitors, each showing a different location. People in their homes, in their cars, walking alone at night. All of them were being watched. And in the center of the room, a single chair, still warm. The Puppet Master had just been there. But before Luke could react, the monitors all changed at once. Every screen now showed his face. And on a giant display in front of him, a new poll appeared. Kill, 99%. The timer began counting down. 10, 9. Luke reached for his gun. 7, 6, 5. The lights cut out. In the darkness, the robotic voice whispered, "The final show has begun." 4, 3, 2. A hand grabbed his shoulder. 1. The screen went black. The Red Room disappeared forever. And Luke Harris was never seen again. Story number 9. The face in the window. It started with a single photograph. Detective Alan Graves wasn't sure why it caught his attention. It was an ordinary family picture. A couple and their little daughter, smiling in front of their house. But in the window behind them, there was a face. A pale, grinning man with hollow black eyes. The problem? The family swore they had been alone when the photo was taken. And when Alan ran a facial recognition scan on the figure in the window, the system returned a match. A man named Walter Beckett, a convicted murderer, executed in 1987. Alan had been in homicide for 15 years. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in mistakes. The photo had to be fake, an AI trick, or an elaborate hoax. So he went to visit the family, the Harpers. Sarah Harper, the mother, trembled as she handed him the original print. "I don't understand," she whispered. "We don't know who he is." Alan studied the image. It wasn't photoshopped. The face in the window was there, etched into the physical film. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" Alan asked. Sarah swallowed hard. "Yes, her husband, Greg," hesitated before adding, "our daughter keeps talking to someone." Alan's gut twisted. "Who?" Greg's voice was barely a whisper. "The man in the window, the man who won't stay dead." That night, Alan went back to the station. He pulled Walter Beckett's file, a man who had been sentenced to death for the brutal murders of 6 families in the 1980s. His pattern: he would appear in their windows for weeks before the killings, watching, waiting, and then one night he would enter. The murders were vicious, bodies torn apart, faces carved into grotesque grins. Alan turned to the last page of the file. A grainy black and white execution photo showed Beckett strapped to an electric chair. His last words? "I'll never stop watching." Alan's fingers curled into fists. This was impossible. Beckett was dead. Wasn't he? The first death. At 3:17 a.m., Alan's phone rang. Greg Harper was dead. Alan raced to the house. Greg's body was found in the living room. His mouth slashed into a wide, bloody grin. His eyes were missing. Sarah was hysterical. "It was him," she sobbed. "I saw him in the window." Alan's blood ran cold. "Where's your daughter?" Sarah's face went pale. They ran to her bedroom. Empty. The window was wide open. The only thing left behind? A single photograph. It showed the little girl, standing outside, holding hands with Walter Beckett. And in the corner of the picture, Alan saw something even worse. A second face in the window. His own. The truth no one can escape. Alan barely remembered calling for backup. He barely remembered the search teams or the way they never found the girl. But he did remember what happened the next night. At 3:17 a.m., his phone buzzed. A single new image. His own apartment window. And in the reflection, standing right behind him, Walter Beckett, smiling, watching, waiting. Alan turned slowly, heart pounding in his chest. The room was empty, but the air was wrong. Heavy, cold, like someone was breathing just behind him. His phone buzzed again. A new message. "Unknown number, you're next." Then, tap, soft, gentle, coming from the window. Alan turned his head, eyes widening. Walter Beckett was there, on the other side of the glass, his face inches away, his grin widening. Alan reached for his gun, but the lights cut out. The last thing he saw was Beckett's fingers pressing against the glass. Then, a whisper, "Let me in." Darkness swallowed the room. Alan screamed, and the next morning, a new photo appeared on Sarah Harper's doorstep. A new face in the window. Alan Graves, smiling. Story number 10. The Lost Episode. In 1997, an episode of Sesame Street aired that no one was supposed to see. It was titled Episode 731. It never re-aired. It never appeared in archives. The official records denied it existed. But some people remembered, and one of them, Alex Carter, was about to find out why. Alex was a media archivist, working for a private firm that restored lost TV footage. One day, while digging through a collection of old VHS tapes, he found something strange. A dusty cassette labeled Sesame Street, Episode 731. Do not view. Curious, he loaded the tape into a player. The screen flickered. The Sesame Street intro played as normal. Big Bird, Elmo, Grover, the whole gang. But something was off. The colors looked washed out. The audio had a low, droning hum underneath the theme song. And when the camera panned to the main set, all the puppets were staring at the screen. Not moving, not blinking, just staring. Alex's stomach tightened. This wasn't right. The wrong version of Sesame Street. The episode began with Bert and Ernie sitting in their apartment. Ernie was silent, just staring at the camera. Bert slowly turned his head to face him. Then, in a deep, distorted voice, he said, "Ernie, you need to wake up." Alex frowned. This wasn't how Sesame Street sounded. Then the screen glitched. For a split second, something else flashed on the screen. A photograph, a real-life image of a little boy's bedroom. The bed was empty, but the closet door was slightly open. Then, just as fast, it switched back to Bert and Ernie. Ernie finally spoke. "But Bert, I don't want to wake up." And then, the TV shut off. Alex blinked. The power in his apartment was still on. The VHS player was still running. But the screen was pitch black. Then, his phone buzzed. A new text message. From an unknown number. "Stop watching. The broadcast that never ended." Alex felt a chill creep up his spine. This had to be a prank. A weird, creepy viral stunt, right? He hit play again. The tape resumed. But now, the Sesame Street set was empty. The camera was shaking. The only sound was heavy, rasping breathing. And then, the screen glitched again. Another photograph. This time, it showed a different bedroom. The same closet. But now, the door was wide open. And in the darkness, a pair of white, staring eyes. Alex's breath caught in his throat. Then, another text. "I warned you." His lights flickered. And from across the room, his closet door creaked open. The truth about episode 731. Alex ripped the VHS out of the player. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he started digging, searching for any mention of episode 731. Most sources denied it existed, but on an obscure forum, he found an old post. Did anyone else see the lost Sesame Street episode? There were hundreds of replies, all saying the same thing. They had watched the tape, and then, that night, something had come for them. Alex's stomach turned. One comment stood out. It said, "Burn the tape, or it'll find you." Alex didn't hesitate. He grabbed the cassette, took it outside, and set it on fire. The plastic melted. The film curled to ash. He never watched it again. But that night, at 3:17 a.m., he woke up cold. His bedroom was pitch black. Except for one thing, the closet door. It was open. And in the darkness, two white, staring eyes. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, Alex's coworkers called him. He didn't answer. They assumed he was sick. Until they received an email. A video attachment. They clicked play. It was footage from Alex's security camera, taken inside his apartment. It showed Alex sleeping in bed. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the closet door slowly opened. A figure stepped out. It was Bert, the puppet, but too tall, too thin. His eyes were completely black. And as he reached for Alex, the screen glitched. The last frame showed a new photograph, a new bedroom, the same closet. And standing in the doorway was Alex, his eyes completely white, and a smile too wide for his face. The email had no message, just one subject line. Episode 731 never ends. Story number 11. The body in room 348. The corpse at the Elegante Hotel stymied the Beaumont, Texas, police. They could find no motive for the killing of popular oil and gas man Greg Flanagan, and no explanation for how he had received his strange internal injuries. Bent on tracking down his killer, Flanagan's widow, Susie, turned to private investigator Ken Brennan, the subject of a previous Vanity Fair story. Once again, as Mark Bowden reports, it was Brennan's sleuthing that cracked the case. Greg Flanagan traveled light and lived tidy. After so many years on the road, he would leave his rolling suitcase open on the floor of his hotel room and use it as a drawer. Dirty clothes went on the closet floor. Shirts he wanted to keep unwrinkled hung above. Toiletries were in the pockets of a cloth folding case that hooked onto a towel rack in the bathroom. At the end of the day, he would slide off his worn brown leather boots and line them up by the suitcase, drop his faded jeans to the floor, and put on lightweight cotton pajama bottoms. Most evenings, he never left the room. He would crank up the air conditioner. He liked a cool room at night and sit on the bed, leaning back on two pillows propped against the headboard. Considerately, to avoid soiling the bedspread, He would lay out a clean white hand towel, on which he placed his ashtray, cigarette pack, lighter, BlackBerry, the TV remote, and a candy bar. He smoked and broke off candy bits while watching TV. This is where Greg was on the evening of Wednesday, September 15, 2010, in room 348 of the MCM Elegante Hotel, in Beaumont, Texas, lounging, smoking, snacking on a Reese's Crispy Crunchy bar, sipping root beer, and watching Iron Man 2. Greg was accustomed to solitary nights. As a young man, he had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months at sea. In middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman, a familiar occupation in South Texas, easing the exploitation of mineral rights on private property for gas and oil companies. Slender, with a close-cropped white beard and the weathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman, he had partnered with his brother, Michael, in a thriving oil land leasing business based in this small city east of Houston. Every Monday morning, he would make the 2-hour drive in his pickup from Lafayette, Louisiana, heading west on Interstate 10 through scruffy Gulf Shore farmland broken only by cell phone towers, oil derricks, and billboards advertising motel chains, bayou restaurants, adult superstores, and other local attractions. It took him through the stink of the big ConocoPhillips refinery at Lake Charles, a forest of piping, giant tanks, and towering chimneys. The hotel was just off the Cloverleaf outside Beaumont. His company rented him a room in the cabana, a 3-story wing that wrapped around a small swimming pool framed by potted palms. Stellan Skarsgård breaks down his career from Mamma Mia to Dune. Part 2. That Wednesday night, watching his movie, Greg got an email from his wife, Susie, shortly after 7. Susie was using a computer program to file for a tax extension. After she reported her progress, he wrote back, "You're doing good, babe." At some point during the loud, computer-generated showdown at the end of the film, amid all the fake violence, Greg was struck from nowhere with a very real and shattering blow. A blow so violent it would blind a man with pain. He managed to get off the bed and move toward the door before he fell, legs splayed and face first. He was probably dead by the time his face hit the green rug. A natural causes thing. The following morning, Susie Flanagan called Greg's office. Husband and wife usually spoke every morning, but he hadn't called. He wasn't answering his phone. When he failed to turn up at the office, 2 of his coworkers drove over to the hotel and knocked on his door. There was no answer, so they got the hotel manager to open it. Their alarmed calls brought an ambulance and the Beaumont police. They found a middle-aged man dead on the rug, prone and doubled over, a spent cigarette cupped delicately between 2 stiff fingers of his left hand. Room 348 was stuffy and exceptionally warm. The man's skin color had gone grayish-blue. There was a wet spot at the crotch of his blue pajamas, but that wasn't unusual. Detective Scott Apple showed up a little more than an hour later. He is a short and very fit man with graying hair that he wears combed straight up in spikes. He is all cop. His wife had been a cop. He met her on the job. He was one of the assault team leaders on the department's SWAT team. He is one of those men who never stop working. But there was little here to interest him. No sign of a break-in or struggle. Nothing disturbed in the room. No blood or obvious wounds. Flanagan's wallet was still in the back pocket of his jeans and had a stack of $100 bills in it. So robbery wasn't an issue. Those staying in nearby rooms had heard nothing. As Apple questioned the neighbors, he told them it was probably a natural causes thing. Sad. He poked around Flanagan's bags, looking mostly for pills, some clue to his collapse. There were none. Susie and Michael later told him that Greg never went to a doctor. He was a stubbornly independent man, suspicious of authority and unmoved by the modern passion for health and fitness. He did not exercise. He had chain-smoked his entire adult life and had the nagging cough to prove it. He neither drank nor ate to excess, but did both freely. It was easy to conclude that his choices had simply caught up with him. Susie was ready to believe it. She was shocked and grief-stricken, but she accepted that, for Greg, sudden death was a possibility. In fact, she took some solace in it. He had checked out on his own terms. Many times she had heard him remark, upon hearing of someone's dying suddenly, "Lucky bastard. That's how I want to go." And so he had. At the hotel, the police saw the death as routine. A photographer snapped pictures to make a record of the scene, and the body was driven by a transport service to the Jefferson County Medical Examiner for an autopsy. The only mystery here appeared to be medical, and it was likely a minor mystery at that. Dr. Tommy Brown had a time-tested method. It took him 45 minutes to conduct a post-mortem exam, inspecting a body inside and out, measuring and weighing organs, all the while describing what he found and noting the metrics that fleshed out the official form. He was all business, crisp, efficient, and confident. Brown was thin and bald on top and had a spray of unruly white hair on the sides that gave off a mad scientist vibe. He did everything fast, he even talked fast. He was a local character, part of the legal landscape in Jefferson County, and a respected one. Where death was concerned, in this corner of Texas, Dr. Tommy Brown's word was law. The circumstances of Greg Flanagan's death, as reported, were unremarkable. On the table before him was a 55-year-old Caucasian male who appeared to be in decent shape. After methodical inspection, the only marks Brown found on the body were a 1-inch abrasion on his left cheek, where his face had hit the rug, and, curiously, a half-inch laceration of his scrotum. This was interesting. The sac itself was swollen and discolored, and around the wound was a small amount of edema fluid. The bruising had spread up through the groin area and across the right. The story his body told grew more intriguing. When Brown opened the front of the torso, he discovered a surprising amount of blood and extensive internal damage. A certain amount of partly digested food had been torn from his intestines. The doctor found small lacerations there, and on the stomach and liver, as well as 2 broken ribs and a hole in the right atrium of his heart. The condition of his insides reflected severe trauma. Flanagan had been beaten to death or crushed. Brown concluded that the wound to his genitals likely had been caused by a hard kick. He had also taken a blow to the chest so severe it had caused lethal damage. He would have bled out in less than 30 seconds. On the official form, next to manner of death, Brown wrote, "Homicide. Whodunit?" When he got this surprising news, Detective Apple called Brown immediately for an explanation. The doctor told him that the man in 348 had suffered the kind of severe internal injuries he was more used to seeing in crash victims, or in someone found under a heavy fallen object. There are not that many murders in Beaumont. Greg's was one of 10 that year, which was about average. Most are not mysterious. Detective work was usually a matter of doing the obvious, interviewing the drunk boyfriend with gunpowder on his hands, or finding the neighborhood drug dealer who was owed money. A case like this was a once-in-a-career event. If you enjoy working a stubborn whodunit, which Apple does, then this one was an exciting challenge. But the problem with the hard cases is that they are indeed hard. Over the next weeks and months, Apple chased down every angle he could imagine to explain the death of Greg Flanagan. But about 6 months into it, he was stuck. The physical evidence didn't add up. Unless Greg had been beaten to death elsewhere, and his body had been returned to the room and carefully placed on the rug, nothing about the scene added up to a crime. How does a man get beaten so severely that ribs crack, inner organs tear, and the heart ruptures, all without significant damage to his torso? Other than the bruising and the cut at his crotch, Flanagan's outer body showed no signs of a beating. And how could such a rumble have taken place in the hotel room without a thing being toppled or even disturbed? Without anyone in adjacent rooms hearing a thing? And there was no answer to the all-important question. Why? Greg appeared to have had no enemies. Apple talked a lot to Susie. She had been in her 20s, a singer in a rock band, when she met Greg. She clearly adored him. Susie was a delightfully offbeat Southern belle, buxom and pretty and warm and oh so deferential, but also, in that time-honored Southern way, stubborn as a tick. She was heartbroken and furious at the same time. Greg was the nicest man she had ever met. He was so nice she had married him twice. First as kids and then, after parting ways for a number of years, again in middle age. When Susie first called him again after that separation, he said, "I've been waiting for you to call." They had been married the second time for 15 years. His brother and co-workers said he had been universally liked in their company. His life at the Elegante rarely intersected with anyone else's. He went to his room early in the evening and usually stayed there by himself until morning. Greg had never been seen down at the bar. He did not socialize or drink a lot or pick up women, so this was not a drunk. This was not a philanderer or a man who got into fights. This was a decent, honorable, smart, and successful man whom people liked. The sort of man nobody would murder, yet somebody had. Through the fall and into the winter of 2010, Apple pursued a number of possibilities. Maintenance records showed that at some point early in the evening of his death, while cooking pre-packaged popcorn in the microwave, Greg had inadvertently blown an electrical circuit. The outage had affected the adjacent room 349 and the rooms directly underneath. Greg had called the front desk to report the outage and confessed his role sheepishly to the man who had come up to reset the breaker. This led to two theories. The first involved sex. The Elegante maintenance man happened to have a rap sheet as a sex offender. Might the puncture wound to the scrotum and internal injuries have been caused by a long screwdriver, some sort of bizarre and kinky assault? Apple spent a lot of time talking to the maintenance man and looking into his background, but this theory never advanced beyond wild suspicion. The second theory involved a group of union electricians staying at the Elegante, a number of whom had been in the room next door, room 349, on the night Greg died. They were in town for an extended stay, doing a job for an oil company. At night, they tended to assemble in one another's rooms to drink. What if some of them had been partying next door when their electricity went out? Might one or more of them have knocked on Greg's door and, perhaps drunk and annoyed, exchanged words with and then assaulted him in the hallway? Could Greg, badly beaten, have returned to his room and then collapsed? Some of the electricians had been questioned on the day the body was found, but none of them said they had had any interaction with the man in 348. 9 days after Greg's death, Apple and a colleague returned to the third floor of the Cabana wing to question some of these same men again. Apple was wearing a hidden video camera. The men they encountered were friendly and appropriately curious. "What happened to that guy, anyway?" asked Lance Mueller, a sharp-featured man with dark, thinning hair dressed in a t-shirt and blue jeans. Mueller was the man registered in room 349, along with a roommate, Tim Steinmetz. "Hell, I don't know," Apple said honestly. "That's what I'm trying to find out. It was almost like something fell on him or something. We're just trying to see if somebody heard something, or maybe if somebody knows somebody heard something, or maybe if somebody messed with him." Mueller and Steinmetz had nothing to offer. The two electricians said they thought they had heard the man in the next room coughing when they returned from the bar. Mueller seemed as confused as Apple was about the idea that something had crushed the man. "There's nothing in these rooms heavy enough," he said. Down the hall, they found 3 more of the electricians, Trent Pano, Thomas Elkins, and Scott Hamilton. The men were friendly and tried to be helpful. One said that, when he had seen the body on a gurney in the elevator, he had first assumed they were caterers delivering a cake or a big food tray. "That's a better thought," said Apple. Pano said he had been in the room with Mueller and Steinmetz that night, but hadn't seen anything. The electricians handed over their driver's licenses and gave Apple their cell phone numbers. They would be in town for a few more months if anything came up. Happy to help. Weeks went by. Months went by. Apple worked any theory he could imagine. He considered the possibility that Susie had had her husband killed. He considered Michael Flanagan, Greg's brother and partner. There was nothing that even hinted at either person. 50 tried to pull together what she had, pronto, and send it off to him. "Well," said Brennan, "you need to fucking take care of yourself," like everything Brennan says. This came in a thick New York accent and a voice that sounds like it's strained through a cubic yard of gravel. It was a noble shit you better listen to me command that was all the more startling because he had said something tender. It endeared him to Susie immediately. Brennan is a former Long Island cop and DEA special agent who now makes a good living as a private detective in Florida. That's why he was on the golf course in February. He is pushing 60, still solid, and always tan and stylish, in the South Florida manner. Blue-eyed, thick-necked, and ruggedly handsome, he is partial to lightweight short-sleeved shirts that show off his torso and big arms. He wears flashes of gold at the neck and wrist, and Irish rings on several fingers. Brennan's hair is mostly white now, and is combed straight back on the sides and straight up in the front in a low-key pompadour, cocky but dignified. Months earlier, not long after Greg was killed, a young lawyer friend, Kia Sherman, had told Susie and Michael about Brennan. Sharing Susie's frustration with the investigation, she had hit upon the strategy of filing a lawsuit against the hotel as a means of pursuing the probe privately. She had read an article by me in this magazine, The Case of the Vanishing Blonde, December 2010, detailing Brennan's remarkable success in resolving a 2005 cold case in Miami. Now, when the investigation seemed hopeless, Sherman brought up Brennan again. If you want to do something, she urged Susie, you have got to call this guy, the one I told you about. Just find him. Brennan can be readily found on the internet and is asked to take more cases than he can handle. People come to him with unsolved murders and disappearances. He takes these people seriously and handles them gently. When he reads a file, he is looking for a case that intrigues him, but also one where he thinks he might be able to accomplish something. I ain't in the business of giving people false hopes, he says. The Flanagan case appealed to him because of the mystery, but also because there were so many avenues to explore. Greg's family and coworkers, hotel guests, the maintenance man. To Detective Apple, none of these leads seemed fresh anymore. To Brennan, they were all new and potentially promising. He knew that a fresh pair of eyes was perhaps the most valuable thing he brought to an investigation. Brennan visited Lafayette in April. He worked Susie over first, asking her a lot of hard questions about their relationship, about Greg's faithfulness, about insurance arrangements, satisfying himself that the wife had no clear motive to have him killed. Let me ask you one more thing, said Brennan. Was there anything about the crime scene that didn't seem right to you? That seemed off. Susie told him that she was surprised that the room was so warm when Greg's coworkers entered it the following morning. Her husband liked to crank up the AC at night. Then Brennan went home and made arrangements for a second trip to Beaumont. Apple came out to a sports bar late to meet him. The two men ate and talked. Brennan told Apple what he always tells the cops he meets in his work. Listen, I'm not a maverick. I don't go doing things half-cocked. If I decide we're going to do this, we're going to do it as a team. There's nothing I'm going to do that you're not going to know about it, and there should be nothing that you're going to do that I don't know about. The one thing I won't do is fuck up your case. I've been doing this a long time, but I also know that you're the guy in charge here, so it's your case. Part of what was going on was Brennan checking out Apple. I don't want to work with somebody I don't like, he told me. He prides himself on being able to read people very quickly. He liked the Beaumont detective. It was mutual. As Apple would put it later, Ken has good people skills. Dried toothpaste. The following morning, Apple picked up Brennan and they visited the hotel room, where Apple showed him the crime scene photos and the autopsy results, and reviewed what he had done over the previous 7 months. Brennan heard him out and then announced, I think I know how this guy died. I think I know when he died. I think I know who killed him. And I think I know how we're going to catch him. Come on, said Apple. Hear me out. I'll tell you what I think. But first I got to call the guy's wife. He called Susie's cell phone. Your husband, was he left or right-handed? He asked. He was right-handed. And when he smoked, did he smoke with the cigarette in his left hand or his right hand? He always smoked with his right hand. You sure? I'm positive. Brennan hung up and explained his conclusions to Apple. Susie had already told him how cold Greg kept his room. This helped fix the time of death. As Brennan saw it, the air conditioner had shut down with everything else when the circuit breaker blew. That time was known. Hotel records showed that their repairman had left Greg alive and well around 8:30 p.m. The movie resumed, and apparently Greg forgot to flip the AC back on. It would have taken a few minutes for the room to grow warm enough for him to notice, and by the time it had, he was dead. That's why he had been found in a warm room. As Brennan put it, in September, it's hot as fuck in Beaumont, Texas. The cigarette scotched the notion that Greg had been beaten severely somewhere else, perhaps even just out in the hall, and then returned to 348. A hallway scenario might explain why nothing had been disturbed in the room, but the cigarette ruled that out. There was no way Greg's attackers, returning him, would have added the fine touch of cupping one hand under his body and delicately placing a burning cigarette between his fingers. It was also unlikely, given the ruptured atrium, that Greg would have had time to return to the room after such a beating and calmly light up before keeling over. More likely, Greg had lit this cigarette himself before whatever happened to him happened. If Greg was right-handed, why was the cigarette found in his left hand? As Brennan pieced it together, examining the state of the room, Greg had gotten up from the bed and headed toward the door, shifting the cigarette to his left hand in order to grab the door handle with his right. It was hard to see this making sense, but Brennan had learned to be patient. It was a mistake to let what you do not know race out ahead of what you do. A crime was a puzzle. If there was even one small piece that did not fit, the puzzle was incomplete. So he was willing to follow the evidence in unlikely directions, even when the conclusions it suggested were absurd. Greg could not have been beaten to death in his room, the evidence suggested, and yet he had died there, and he had died quickly after sustaining his wounds. Somehow, that's what had happened. He didn't know yet how it had happened, but he was convinced that Greg had been quietly minding his own business just minutes, even seconds, before he was killed. This is what led to the electricians, who were close. Their room had been partly blacked out by the blown circuit at the same time Greg's had been. So, of all the scenarios Apple had considered, this was the one that made the most sense. The union guys may well have been drunk, and may have confronted Greg in the doorway of his room, exchanged words, and kicked him to death right there. He asked Apple if he had interviewed them. "Yeah, they were nice," said Apple. "See anything hinky?" No. I'm sure if they were drinking they had to talk about it to each other," said Brennan. "So somebody knows about them. Probably one or two of their close friends or their coworkers are going to know about this." They next paid a visit to Dr. Brown. Ken wanted to know if the injuries Brown had seen might have been caused by a severe beating. They might have, the doctor said. The laceration of the scrotum could have been caused by a hard kick, especially if the assailant had been wearing steel-toed boots. The electricians next door wore construction boots. Brennan asked Apple to start interviewing men who had worked with the union electricians the previous summer. He returned home to continue inspecting the hotel's surveillance video. It was time-consuming work and not particularly helpful. He calls it looking to see the to and fro. The cameras showed Greg coming in from work that evening. They showed several of the electricians making trips to their vehicles in the parking lot. But there was nothing obviously suspicious. When Brennan returned to Beaumont in late May, he and Apple went to see some of the coworkers who had not yet been interviewed. By this time, the union electricians had been gone for 7 months. Apple's efforts with the coworkers had uncovered nothing, but Brennan was convinced it was worthwhile. Human nature being what it was, if any of the electricians knew something about Greg's death, word would have spread. So they made the rounds. Yes, most of the men had heard about the man who died in the Elegante Hotel. What a shame. Did anyone know yet what had happened to him? All of what these men knew was second or third hand or worse, and was predictably confused. As Brennan would remember it later, one of the crew foremen, a man named Aaron Bork, had heard something about a gun going off in a boarding house. No, Apple corrected him. That's not the same case. This was the one where a man got in a fight at the Elegante Hotel. Bork had heard nothing about that. As they drove away from Bork's house, Brennan said, "We need to go back to the hotel." "What are we going back there for?" Apple asked, noting that he and Ken had checked out the room thoroughly. "We're going to look for a bullet." In room 348, they began inspecting the floor, the furniture, the walls, everything. They were both working on their hands and knees, shining flashlights under furniture. They found nothing. Brennan was frustrated, because he was now convinced that somehow a gun had been involved. They were about to give up when he noticed an indentation in the wall alongside the closed door that led into the adjoining room. The indentation was a repair job. It appeared to be right where the handle of the door would hit the wall, typical hotel room wear and tear. But when he swung the door open, the knob and the dent didn't quite match. The doorknob touched the wall slightly to the right. "Let's take a look at the other side," Brennan suggested. When they got the hotel security guy to let them into room 349, there was no mistaking what they found on the wall there. Brennan stood alongside a small neat hole in the wall that had been patched with a daub of faintly pink filler that turned out to be dried toothpaste. He measured its height against his hip, then walked back to 348 and measured the indentation. They lined up. A bullet had gone through the wall. The small, neat hole in 349 marked its entry. The larger hole in 348, its exit. Beaumont's crime scene investigators carefully excavated both holes and shined a laser through. The trajectory pointed straight up to the bed where Greg had been sitting, smoking, eating candy, and watching his movie. Brennan said, "This motherfucker was shot." Dr. Brown was not convinced. He had examined the man's body from head to toe, cut him open, inspected his inner organs one by one, and reversed the expectations of the police. With precision and with the insight of years, he had determined that Greg Flanagan died not from natural causes but from a severe beating. Now they wanted to tell him that his careful and professional observations were wrong, that he had missed, of all things, a bullet wound. Brennan volunteered to do the talking. After he and Apple had found the bullet hole and traced the trajectory, the answer to the mystery of Greg's death was, he believed, clear. But in order to act, in order to bring Greg's killer or killers to justice, they would have to get the coroner to rewrite his findings. You could not argue in court that a defendant had shot someone if the medical examiner's office had concluded that the victim had not been shot. Brown's office was a mess. Papers, files, books everywhere. Every available surface was buried, even the floor. They cleared away space on 2 chairs to sit down, and when they mentioned they were working the Flanagan case, the doctor asked, "Oh, did you catch the guy that beat him up?" "No, we're not there yet," said Brennan, and he then started to explain what they had discovered, trying to approach the subject delicately. Brown quickly got the picture. "You're trying to tell me that this man was shot," he said. "I'm telling you he wasn't shot." He could see where this was heading, and he flatly refused to order the body exhumed. Exhumation is a pain in the ass. It is expensive, disturbing to the family, and a hell of a lot of work. And in this case, as it happens, it was impossible since the body had been cremated. The ovens were hot enough to destroy metal fragments. "Listen, Doc," Brennan proposed, "let's just take out the photos from the autopsy and go through them and see what we can find." Brown humored them. As they looked through the photographs, passing them back and forth across the desk, Brennan pointed out things. "What about this here?" he said, indicating a spot of damage. "Yes, that's the liver. And what about this here?" "Yes, that's the intestines." Brennan knew what he was looking at. The bullet had entered Greg's scrotum and torn up through him. The skin of the scrotum was soft and pliable, and it had folded over the entry wound, making it less obvious what it was. The internal injuries traced the bullet's fatal trajectory. Brennan asked, "Doc, could all of this damage have been done? Besides blunt force trauma, could a bullet cause the same?" "Yes, it could, but that's not what happened here. This man was beaten." "Okay, Doc, but could it have?" Brennan found something in a photo that supported his argument. It looked like a track. "You could get the same thing from being beaten," Brown explained. Then they got to the heart. Brown passed the photo to the detectives. "Doc," Brennan said. "What?" "That's a bullet hole document." Brown took the photo. "What?" Brennan pointed. "That's a fucking bullet hole." Brown explained that sometimes when a man is kicked or hit with a blunt object in the chest, it is the right atrium that normally bursts. "Doc, that's a fucking bullet hole." Brown looked again. "Yeah, that's a bullet hole." After a long moment he added, "The media is going to kill me on this. You've got a problem." Tim Steinmetz must have been feeling pretty okay about this meeting with the Texas cops. Getting called had been a shocker. It was more than 7 months since he and Lance Mueller had come home from the job in Beaumont. Now 2 cops from down there had come all the way to Wisconsin to see him and to question him about the guy who had died next door. It had been worrisome. He and Mueller had conferred about it beforehand by phone and made sure their stories were straight. Steinmetz met the detectives in an interview room at the Chippewa County Sheriff's Department, and, really, they could not have been nicer. Tim sat in a swivel chair on one side of a big wooden table, and they sat opposite him with their notebooks open and files handy. Very official. They thanked him for coming in. They assured him that this was routine, and they had walked him through the evening, asking a lot of questions, with Steinmetz answering diligently, trying to remember every detail. Leaving out the part about the gun, of course, but the detectives had not pushed him at all. You heard that the guy next door to you died? Asked the older one, the big man with the white hair combed straight up in front. Ken Brennan. We did hear that, said Steinmetz. But we really didn't know for sure what the hell was going on. We had no idea. We didn't hear no commotion next door. No banging, no nothing. That's why this is kind of weird. Brennan and Apple took notes. Then Apple carefully wrote out Steinmetz's statement. And that's it, huh? The electrician asked. That's it, said Apple. You guys flew all the way here for that? Brennan asked Steinmetz to go through the statement, read it out loud, and make any corrections he wanted. Steinmetz noticed that Apple had put down that he was an apprentice, so he changed that to journeyman, a few other little things. He initialed all the places where he made a change. Then they brought in a local cop to notarize the statement right there in front of him. So Steinmetz was feeling pretty good when he stood up to go. Is that it? He asked. Hang on a second, said Brennan. His tone was different now, harsh. It was until you signed that statement. Now you've got a problem. Okay, said Steinmetz, startled. He sat down again. Now tell us what really happened, said Brennan. Because we know what happened. Because now you're going to jail with him. Do you want to go to jail with Lance? Why am I going to go to jail with Lance? You just made a false police report, that's why, said Brennan. Tim, we know what happened, said Apple, speaking more gently. We know everything that happened down there. And I realize you were trying to be noble and protect a friend. But you are about to get your whole family in a bind. And it's not worth it. It's not worth it. So, just tell us what happened, said Brennan. Out came the whole story, corroborated later that same day, June 1st, 2011, in an interview with Trent Pano, who had been in 349 with them. Between the two accounts, the following scenario emerged. They had been drinking beer. Mueller asked Pano to fetch a bottle of whiskey from his car, and to also bring up his pistol, a 9mm Ruger. When Pano returned, Mueller took out the handgun and, to the other's alarm, started playing with it. He pointed it at Steinmetz, who dropped to the floor and cursed at him, and he was pointing it in Pisano's direction at the foot of the bed when it went off. Pano thought for a second that he had been hit, but then turned to see a hole in the wall behind him. Mueller freaked out, they both said. Mueller bundled up the gun and took it back out to his car. When he returned, Pano had left for his own room, disgusted. Mueller and Steinmetz went downstairs to the bar. Steinmetz said they had not known for sure there was anyone staying in the room next door until, as he remembered, they heard someone in the room coughing very late, after midnight, when they came back from the bar. He held nothing back. Steinmetz's second statement, the truthful one, laid out the whole thing. It was good to get it off his chest. When he and Mueller had seen the police at room 348 the next morning, and had seen the gurney, they were disturbed, he told Brennan. I thought he had killed that guy. The only detail that didn't fit was this business of hearing a cough behind the closed door of room 348 when the two returned from the bar. For several reasons, neither Brennan nor Apple was inclined to place much weight on it. If it was true, then Greg had survived the gunshot for far longer than the coroner believed possible, but it did not alter the cause of death. If anything, it made the electrician's failure to check on him or call for help all the more egregious. More likely is that they had heard Greg coughing in the room the previous evening. They had been in the room next to him that night too. They were drunk. Fixing the cough late on the night Greg died was the only shred of their story that contradicted the detective's reconstruction, and they clung to it, even though it hardly mattered. Did anybody knock on the door next door to check on the guy? Brennan asked. No, said Steinmetz. I always ask myself, if I was in a situation like this, what would I do? And I admit, he never finished the thought. The detectives had something else they wanted him to do. A long silence. Hey, Lance, what's up? Asked Steinmetz. He dialed Mueller on his cell phone. Apple and Brennan were recording the conversation. Not much, said Mueller. Just sitting around. Well, I just got back from down there. How did it go? Well, I told them the whole story. What had happened, that we were sticking to their, what's that? The story that we were sticking to, that we got home late that night, and the guy coughed and whatever, right? And, Steinmetz began to hem and haw. And, I was going to leave there then, because your lawyer said it would be okay, right? right? And when I left there, they said, okay, tell us the truth. So I told them the truth, what really happened. There was a long silence on the other end. About the gun going off and all that? Mueller asked. Yep. What did they say? Well, that I would be in trouble, if I didn't tell them. Another silence. So what did they say? Not much. I don't know if they are going to get a hold of you or Trent, or what the hell they're going to do. Mueller sighed heavily. Then he groaned. What did they mean by that? I mean, tell us the truth? Did they say anything about the gun prior to that, or what? No. They just said they knew exactly what happened. Told me to stop fucking lying. They were pretty pissed. And then I told them exactly how everything went down, and what really and truly happened. Steinmetz suggested that Mueller call Apple right away. They probably are going to come and get your ass, now that they know the truth and everything. You should probably try to make some kind of effort, The guy, he died from the gunshot. Are you shitting me, Tim? No, I'm not. Oh, my God. Are you kidding me? Are you serious right now? I'm serious as a heart attack, Lance. Mueller refused to believe it. For the next few minutes of the call, he went around and around with Steinmetz. His lawyer had obtained the autopsy report and assured him that the man had not died of a gunshot wound. The story had been all over the news. It doesn't make sense, he said. If there was a gunshot, if he was killed from, a firearm, they would have said something on the damn news. Mueller had worked hard to convince himself that the accidental gunshot and the death of the man in 348 were unrelated. And the autopsy report had confirmed it. It doesn't make sense. First, the coroner ruled that it was a heart attack. Then they started saying that something fell on him. There's no way. There's absolutely no way that guy was killed by a bullet. He asked Steinmetz how he was doing. How am I doing? Steinmetz said. Not good. I need to drink some more beers. Mueller apparently applied the same remedy, because he later phoned Brennan, clearly intoxicated, and started trying to explain himself. He said he wanted to make a statement. You're drunk, Brennan told him. I suggest you call your fucking attorney. Case closed. Brennan was worried when the judge started reading the sentence. He had flown to Beaumont on October 29, 2012, to join Susie Flanagan and Scott Apple and a group of Greg's family and friends for the sentencing of Lance Mueller. The electrician had entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. As Brennan remembered it, the judge began by saying that this whole tragedy might be seen just as a terrible accident. Oh fuck, thought Brennan. Here it goes. Don't tell me this guy is going to get a year or something. But then the judge started cataloging the long list of willfully irresponsible choices that had led to this day. More like it, thought Brennan. The judge gave Mueller 10 years, half of what the law allowed. The apology Mueller offered in court, no matter how sincere, came way too late. There was his criminally irresponsible decision to drunkenly play with the gun. As Steinmetz had said, they had suspected from the start that the errant bullet had at least helped kill the man in room 348. Even a heart attack, which had been the first assumption as the police rolled his body out on a gurney, might have been triggered by the gunshot. Then, after the coroner had ruled that Greg had died of blunt force trauma, Mueller was happy to accept that something might have crushed him to death, even if it was hard to imagine what. Still, he had been worried enough about the gunshot. He had himself patched the hole with toothpaste. He had hidden the gun immediately in his car, then stashed it with a friend for the first few days after the incident, and had then handed it over to an attorney for safekeeping before he left Texas. What a huge mistake. If he had come forward at any time prior to Brennan and Apple solving the mystery, which had taken about 8 months, it is unlikely he would have been charged with manslaughter, much less have gone to jail. Mueller had gambled from the start that whatever connection he had to Greg's death would never be discovered. The odds in his favor were good, too. As it was, even after the connection was made, the county district attorney's office had been reluctant to prosecute the case as a felony. Brennan had turned that idea around. When he found out that the prosecutor might opt for a plea deal, he flew to Beaumont and joined a meeting between Apple and Paul Noyola, an investigator for the DA's office. Noyola explained that accidental gun discharges in Texas were not uncommon, and that juries and judges tended to understand them, and that, well, the whole issue of accidental deaths was a fairly gray area of the Texas criminal code. In other words, the whole thing was looking like more of a hassle than a slam dunk. The private detective was indignant. He arranged to bring Susie Flanagan to Beaumont for a meeting with the assistant DA in charge of the case. Among other complications, the ADA told them Mueller's gun was still locked in the lawyer's safe, and the lawyer was making noises about fighting efforts to have it turned over. "I suggest you go down there with a search warrant and a fucking blowtorch and go get the fucking weapon," Brennan said. "It's evidence of a capital crime." "What the fuck are you talking about?" Brennan was pretty worked up. Here's what he remembers saying. "The victim was important to everybody here," he said, gesturing around the table. "And we're not going to let this thing be brushed under the rug. Let somebody take a plea on this. This is not a fucking accident. An accident is when somebody comes in, has taken off their gun discharges, and, God forbid, somebody is hit. That's one thing. It's completely different when somebody fucking brings a gun that they shouldn't have into another fucking state, shit-faced drunk, fucking around with a gun. The people with him realize that something bad could happen. He discharges a round, almost kills the guy he's with, and then he does kill somebody on the other side of the wall. He knows that's something that could happen. It's an occupied hotel. He doesn't even bother to knock on the door next door to see if anybody's hurt. And after that, his answer to the whole thing is to go get drunk some more in the fucking bar of the hotel. And then when he sees a body being taken out the next day, and he is 100% certain he killed somebody, he decides not to say anything about it but run to his attorney and leave the fucking weapon in a safe, and the fucking attorney doesn't say anything about it either. You know what that is? That's fucking murder. So if you think we're gonna forget about this fucking thing, think again. Because that ain't fucking happening. Brennan's anger can fill a room. After Mueller was sentenced, Brennan and Apple went out for a celebratory lunch. Brennan ordered a cocktail. Apple, who was on duty, didn't. They made plans to play a round of golf together. In the courtroom that day, Susie Flanagan had a chance to speak to Mueller directly. "I have waited over 2 years to look you in the face, eye to eye, and simply have the chance to speak directly to you," she said. "You would never have come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him with every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. He meant nothing to you." Later, Susie told me that she watched Mueller's face as the sentence was pronounced, and that he had looked terribly shocked. That was good, she thought. He's shocked, but not as shocked as my husband was. That night in room 348, relaxing, smoking, watching Iron Man 2, Greg Flanagan could not have known what hit him in the moments before he died. Mueller knew exactly what was hitting him. "You have met your match," said the small woman, staring across the courtroom at him. "A study in controlled ferocity. I would have spent the rest of my life tracking you down. And I found you, Greg's murderer. I brought you to justice." Story number 12. Christian Bala, left, insisted that his violent novel was a sophisticated work of fiction, but Jacek Wróblewski was certain that it held the key to an unsolved murder. In the southwest corner of Poland, far from any town or city, the Oder River curls sharply, creating a tiny inlet. The banks are matted with wild grass and shrouded by towering pine and oak trees. The only people who regularly trek to the area are fishermen. The inlet teems with perch and pike and sun bass. On a cold December day in 2000, 3 friends were casting there when one of them noticed something floating by the shore. At first, he thought it was a log, but as he drew closer, he saw what looked like hair. The fisherman shouted to one of his friends, who poked the object with his rod. It was a dead body. The fisherman called the police, who carefully removed the corpse of a man from the water. A noose was around his neck, and his hands were bound behind his back. Part of the rope, which appeared to have been cut with a knife, had once connected his hands to his neck, binding the man in a backward cradle, an excruciating position. The slightest wiggle would have caused the noose to tighten further. There was no doubt that the man had been murdered. His body was clothed in only a sweatshirt and underwear, and it bore marks of torture. A pathologist determined that the victim had virtually no food in his intestines, which indicated that he had been starved for several days before he was killed. Initially, The police thought that he had been strangled and then dumped in the river, but an examination of fluids in his lungs revealed signs of drowning, which meant that he was probably still alive when he was dropped into the water. The victim, tall, with long dark hair and blue eyes, seemed to match the description of a 35-year-old businessman named Dariusz Janishevsky, who had lived in the city of Wrocław, 60 miles away, and who had been reported missing by his wife nearly 4 weeks earlier. He had last been seen on November 13th, leaving the small advertising firm that he owned in downtown Wrocław. When the police summoned Janishevsky's wife to see if she could identify the body, she was too distraught to look, and so Janishevsky's mother did instead. She immediately recognized her son's flowing hair and the birthmark on his chest. The police launched a major investigation. Scuba divers plunged into the frigid river, looking for evidence. Forensic specialists combed the forest. Dozens of associates were questioned, and Janishevsky's business records were examined. Nothing of note was found, although Janishevsky and his wife, who had wed 8 years earlier, had a brief period of trouble in their marriage. They had since reconciled and were about to adopt a child. He had no apparent debts or enemies, and no criminal record. Witnesses described him as a gentle man, an amateur guitarist who composed music for his rock band. He was not the kind of person who would provoke fights, his wife said. He wouldn't harm anybody. After 6 months, the investigation was dropped because of an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the prosecutor put it in his report. Janishevsky's family hung a cross on an oak tree near where the body was found, one of the few reminders of what the Polish press dubbed the perfect crime. One afternoon in the fall of 2003, Jacek Wróblewski, a 38-year-old detective in the Wrocław Police Department, unlocked the safe in his office, where he stored his files, and removed a folder marked Janishevsky. It was getting late, and most members of the department would soon be heading home, their thick wooden doors clapping shut, one after the other, in the long stone corridor of the fortress-like building, which the Germans had built in the early 20th century, when Wrocław was still part of Germany. The building has underground tunnels leading to the jail and the courthouse across the street. Wróblewski, who preferred to work late at night, kept by his desk a coffee pot and a small refrigerator. That was about all he could squeeze into the cell-like room, which was decorated with wall-sized maps of Poland and with calendars of scantily clad women, which he took down when he had official visitors. The Janishevsky case was 3 years old, and had been handed over to Wróblewski's unit by the local police who had conducted the original investigation. The unsolved murder was the coldest of cold cases, and Wróblewski was drawn to it. He was a tall, lumbering man with a pink, fleshy face and a burgeoning paunch. He wore ordinary slacks and a shirt to work instead of a uniform, and there was a simplicity to his appearance, which he used to his advantage. People trusted him because they thought that they had no reason to fear him. Even his superiors joked that his cases must somehow solve themselves. Jacek is Jack in English, and Wróbel means sparrow, and so his colleagues called him Jack Sparrow, the name of the Johnny Depp character in Pirates of the Caribbean. Wróblewski liked to say in response, "I'm more of an eagle." After Wróblewski graduated from high school in 1984, he began searching for his purpose in life, as he put it, working variously as a municipal clerk, a locksmith, a soldier, an aircraft mechanic, and, in defiance of the communist government, a union organizer allied with Solidarity. In 1994, 5 years after the communist regime collapsed, he joined the newly refashioned police force. Salaries for police officers in Poland were, and remain, dismal. A rookie earns only a few $1,000s a year, and Wróblewski had a wife and 2 children to support. Still, he had finally found a position that suited him. A man with a stark Catholic vision of good and evil, he relished chasing criminals, and after putting away his first murderer, he hung a pair of goat horns on his office wall to symbolize the capture of his prey. During his few free hours, he studied psychology at a local university. He wanted to understand the criminal mind. Wróblewski had heard about the murder of Janishevsky, but he was unfamiliar with the details, and he sat down at his desk to review the file. He knew that, in cold cases, the key to solving the crime is often an overlooked clue buried in the original file. He studied the pathologist's report and the photographs of the crime scene. The level of brutality, Wróblewski thought, suggested that the perpetrator or perpetrators had a deep grievance against Janishevsky. Moreover, the virtual absence of clothing on Yanishevsky's battered body indicated that he had been stripped, in an attempt to humiliate him. According to Yanishevsky's wife, her husband always carried credit cards, but they had not been used after the crime. Another indication that this was no mere robbery. Wroblewski read the various statements that had been given to the local police. The most revealing was from Yanishevsky's mother, who had worked as a bookkeeper in his advertising firm. On the day that her son disappeared, she stated, a man had called the office at around 9:30 a.m., looking for him. The caller made an urgent request. Could you make 3 signs, quite big ones, and the third one as big as a billboard? He asked. When she inquired further, he said, I will not talk to you about this, demanding again to speak to her son. She explained that he was out of the office, but she gave the caller Yanishevsky's cell phone number. The man hung up. He had not identified himself, and Yanishevsky's mother had not recognized his voice, though she thought that he sounded professional. During the conversation, she had heard noise in the background, a dull roar. Later, when her son showed up at the office, she asked him if the customer had called, and Yanishevsky replied that they had arranged to meet that afternoon. According to a receptionist in the building, who was the last known person to see Yanishevsky alive, he departed the office at around 4 o'clock. He left his car, a Peugeot, in the parking lot, which his family said was very unusual. Although he often met with customers away from the office, he habitually took his car. Investigators, upon checking phone records, discovered that the call to Yanishevsky's office had come from a phone booth down the street. This explained the background noise, Wroblewski thought. Records also indicated that, less than a minute after the call ended, someone at the same public phone had rung Yanishevsky's cell phone. Though the calls were suspicious, Wroblewski could not be certain that the caller was a perpetrator, just as he could not yet say how many assailants were involved in the crime. Yanishevsky was more than 6 feet tall and weighed some 200 pounds, and tying him up and disposing of his body may have required accomplices. The receptionist reported that when Yanishevsky left the office, she had seen 2 men seemingly trailing him, though she could not describe them in any detail. Whoever was behind the abduction, Wroblewski thought, had been extremely organized and shrewd. The mastermind, Wroblewski assumed it was a man, based on the caller's voice. Must have studied Yanishevsky's business routine and known how to lure him out of his office and, possibly, into a car. Wroblewski pored over the materials, trying to find something more, yet he remained stymied. After several hours, he locked the file in his safe, but over the next several days and nights he took it out again and again. At one point, he realized that Yanishevsky's cell phone had never been found. Wroblewski decided to see if the phone could be traced, an unlikely possibility. Poland lagged behind other European countries in technological development, and its financially strapped police force was only beginning to adopt more sophisticated methods of tracking cellular and computer communications. Nevertheless, Wroblewski had taken a keen interest in these new techniques, and he began an elaborate search, with the help of the department's recently hired telecommunications specialist. Although Yanishevsky's telephone number had not been used since his disappearance, Wroblewski knew that cell phones often bear a serial number from the manufacturer, and his men contacted Yanishevsky's wife, who provided a receipt containing this information. To Wroblewski's astonishment, he and his colleagues soon found a match. A cell phone with the same serial number had been sold on Allegro, an internet auction site, for days after Yanishevsky disappeared. The seller had logged in as Chris B7, who, investigators learned, was a 30-year-old Polish intellectual named Christian Bala. It seemed inconceivable that a murderer who had orchestrated such a well-planned crime would have sold the victim's cell phone on an internet auction site. Bala, Wroblewski realized, could have obtained it from someone else, or purchased it at a pawn shop, or even found it on the street. Bala had since moved abroad, and could not be easily reached. But as Wroblewski checked into his background, he discovered that he had recently published a novel called Amok. Wroblewski obtained a copy, which had on the cover a surreal image of a goat, an ancient symbol of the devil. Like the works of the French novelist Michel Houellebecq, the book is sadistic, pornographic, and creepy. The main character, who narrates the story, is a bored Polish intellectual who, when not musing about philosophy, is drinking and having sex with women. Wroblewski, who read mostly history books, was shocked by the novel's contents, which were not only decadent but vehemently anti-church. He made note of the fact that the narrator murders a female lover for no reason. What had come over me? What the hell did I do? And conceals the act so well that he is never caught. Wroblewski was struck, in particular, by the killer's method. I tightened the noose around her neck. Wroblewski then noticed something else. The killer's name is Chris, the English version of the author's first name. It was also the name that Christian Bala had posted on the internet auction site. Wroblewski began to read the book more closely, a hardened cop turned literary detective. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1999, Christian Bala sat in a cafe in Wrocław wearing a three-piece suit. He was going to be filmed for a documentary called Young Money about the new generation of businessmen in the suddenly freewheeling Polish capitalist system. Bala, who was then 26, had been chosen for the documentary because he had started an industrial cleaning business that used advanced machinery from the United States. Though Bala had dressed up for the occasion, he looked more like a brooding poet than like a businessman. He had dark, ruminative eyes and thick curly brown hair. Slender and sensitive-looking, he was so handsome that his friends had nicknamed him Amour. He chain-smoked and spoke like a professor of philosophy, which is what he had trained and still hoped to become. I don't feel like a businessman, Bala later told the interviewer, adding that he had always dreamed of an academic career. He had been the equivalent of high school valedictorian and, as an undergraduate at the University of Wrocław, which he attended from 1992 to 1997, he was considered one of the brightest philosophy students. The night before an exam, while other students were cramming, he often stayed out drinking and carousing, only to show up the next morning, disheveled and hungover, and score the highest marks. One time I went out with him and nearly died taking the exam. His close friend and former classmate Lothar Rosinski, who now teaches philosophy at another university in Wrocław, recalls. Beata Sierraka, who was one of Bala's philosophy professors, says that he had a voracious appetite for learning and an inquisitive, rebellious mind. Bala, who often stayed with his parents in Chojno, a provincial town outside Wrocław, began bringing home stacks of philosophy books, lining the hallways and filling the basement. Poland's philosophy departments had long been dominated by Marxism, which, like liberalism, is rooted in Enlightenment notions of reason and in the pursuit of universal truths. Bala, however, was drawn to the radical arguments of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who maintained that language, like a game of chess, is essentially a social activity. Bala often referred to Wittgenstein as my master. He also seized on Friedrich Nietzsche's notorious contention that there are no facts, only interpretations, and that truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. For Bala, such subversive ideas made particular sense after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, where language and facts had been wildly manipulated to create a false sense of history. The end of communism marked the death of one of the great meta-narratives, Bala later told me, paraphrasing the postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard. Bala once wrote in an email to a friend, "Read Wittgenstein and Nietzsche 20 times each." Bala's father, Stanislaw, who was a construction worker and a taxi driver, "I'm a simple, uneducated man," he says, was proud of his son's academic accomplishments. Still, he occasionally wanted to throw away Christian's books and force him to plant with me in the garden. Stanislaw sometimes worked in France, and during the summer Christian frequently went with him to earn extra money for his studies. He would bring suitcases stuffed with books, Stanislaw recalls. He would work all day and study through the night. I used to joke that he knew more about France from books than from seeing it. By then, Bala had become entranced by French postmodernists such as Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. He was particularly interested in Derrida's notion that not only is language too unstable to pinpoint any absolute truth, human identity itself is the malleable product of language. Bala wrote a thesis about Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, who famously declared, "The guise of convincing your peers is the very face of truth itself." Bala interpreted these thinkers idiosyncratically, pulling threads here and there, and often twisting and turning and distorting them, until he had braided them into his own radical philosophy. To amuse himself, he began constructing myths about himself. An adventure in Paris, a romance with a schoolmate, and tried to convince friends that they were true. He would tell these tall stories about himself, Rosinski says. If he told one person, and that person then told someone else who told someone else, it became true. It existed in the language. Rosinski adds, Christian even had a term for it. He called it mythocreativity. Before long, friends had trouble distinguishing his real character from the one he had invented. In an email to a friend, Bala said, "If I ever write an autobiography, it will be full of myths." Bala cast himself as an enfant terrible who sought out what Foucault had called a limit experience. He wanted to push the boundaries of language and human existence, to break free of what he deemed to be the hypocritical and oppressive truths of Western society, including taboos on sex and drugs. Foucault himself was drawn to homosexual sadomasochism. Bala devoured the works of Georges Bataille, who vowed to brutally oppose all systems and who once contemplated carrying out human sacrifices, and William Burroughs, who swore to use language to rub out the word, and the Marquis de Sade, who demanded, "Oh man, is it for you to say what is good or what is evil?" Bala boasted about his drunken visits to brothels and his submission to temptations of the flesh. He told friends that he hated conventions and was capable of anything, and he insisted, "I will not live long, but I will live furiously." Some people found such proclamations juvenile, even ridiculous. Others were mesmerized by them. There were legends that no woman could resist him, one friend recalled. Those closest to him regarded his tales simply as playful confabulations. Siraka, his former professor, says that Bala, in reality, was always a kind, energetic, hardworking, and principled. His friend Rosinski says, Christian liked the idea of being this Nietzschean Superman, but anyone who knew him well realized that, as with his language games, he was just playing around. In 1995, Bala, belying his libertine posture, married his high school sweetheart, Stanislava, or Stasia, as he called her. Stasia, who had dropped out of high school and worked as a secretary, showed little interest in language or philosophy. Bala's mother opposed the marriage, believing Stasia was ill-suited for her son. "I thought he should at least wait until he had finished his studies," she says. But Bala insisted that he wanted to take care of Stasia, who had always loved him, and in 1997 their son Casper was born. That year, Bala graduated from the university with the highest possible marks and enrolled in its PhD program in philosophy. Although he received a full academic scholarship, he struggled to support his family and soon left school to open his cleaning business. In the documentary on Poland's new generation of businessmen, Bala says, "Reality came and kicked me in the ass." With an air of resignation, he continues, "Once, I planned to paint graffiti on walls. Now I'm trying to wash it off." He was not a good businessman. Whenever money came in, colleagues say, instead of investing it in his company, he spent it. By 2000, he had filed for bankruptcy. His marriage also collapsed. The basic problem was women. His wife later said, "I knew that he was having an affair." After Stasia separated from him, he seemed despondent and left Poland, traveling to the United States, and later to Asia, where he taught English and scuba diving. He began to work intensively on Amok, which encapsulated all his philosophical obsessions. The story mirrors Crime and Punishment, in which Raskolnikov, convinced that he is a superior being who can deliver his own form of justice, murders a wretched pawnbroker. Wouldn't thousands of good deeds make up for one tiny little crime? Raskolnikov asks. If Raskolnikov is a Frankenstein's monster of modernity, then Chris, the protagonist of Amok, is a monster of postmodernity. In his view, not only is there no sacred being, God, if you only existed, you'd see how sperm looks on blood. There is also no truth. Truth is being displaced by narrative. One character admits that he doesn't know which of his constructed personalities is real. And Chris says, "I'm a good liar, because I believe in the lies myself, unbound by any sense of truth, moral, scientific, historical, biographical, legal." Chris embarks on a grisly rampage. After his wife catches him having sex with her best friend and leaves him, Chris says that he has, at least, stripped her of her illusions. He sleeps with one woman after another, the sex ranging from numbing to sadomasochistic. Inverting convention, he lusts after ugly women, insisting that they are more real, more touchable, more alive. He drinks too much. He spews vulgarities, determined, as one character puts it, to pulverize the language, to screw it like no one else has ever screwed it. He mocks traditional philosophers and blasphemes the Catholic Church. In one scene, he gets drunk with a friend and steals from a church a statue of Saint Anthony, the Egyptian saint who lived secluded in the desert, battling the temptations of the devil and who fascinated Foucault. Foucault, describing how Saint Anthony had turned to the Bible to ward off the devil, only to encounter a bloody description of Jews slaughtering their enemies, writes that evil is not embodied in individuals, but incorporated in words, and that even a book of salvation can open the gates to hell. Finally, Chris, repudiating what is considered the ultimate moral truth, kills his girlfriend Mary. I tighten the noose around her neck, holding her down with one hand, he says. With my other hand, I stabbed the knife below her left breast. Everything was covered in blood. He then ejaculates on her. In a perverse echo of Wittgenstein's notion that some actions defy language, Chris says of the killing, there was no noise, no words, no movement. Complete silence. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov confesses his sins and is punished for them, while being redeemed by the love of a woman named Sonia, who helps to guide him back toward a pre-modern Christian order. But Chris never removes what he calls his white gloves of silence, and he is never punished. Murder leaves no stain, he declares. And his wife, who, not coincidentally, is also named Sonia, never returns to him. The style and structure of Amok, which is derivative of many postmodern novels, reinforces the idea that truth is illusory. What is a novel, anyway, but a lie, a mythocreation? Bala's narrator often addresses the reader, reminding him that he is being seduced by a work of fiction. I am starting my story, Chris says. I must avoid boring you. In another typical flourish, Chris reveals that he is reading a book about the violent rebellion of a young author with a guilty conscience. In other words, the same story as Amok. I hated how they acted so much greener than thou. Throughout the book, Bala plays with words in order to emphasize their slipperiness. The title of one chapter, Screwdriver, refers simultaneously to the tool, the cocktail, and Chris's sexual behavior. Even when Chris slaughters Mary, it feels like a language game. I pulled the knife and rope from underneath the bed, as if I were about to begin a children's fairy tale, Chris says. Then I started unwinding this fable of rope, and to make it more interesting I started to make a noose. Took me 2 million years. Bala finished the book toward the end of 2002. He had given Chris a biography similar to his own, blurring the boundary between author and narrator. He even posted sections of the book on a blog called Amok, and during discussions with readers he wrote comments under the name Chris, as if he were the character. After the book came out in 2003, an interviewer asked him, "Some authors write only to release their Mr. Hyde, the dark side of their psyche. Do you agree?" Bala joked in response, "I know what you are driving at, but I won't comment." It might turn out that Christian Bala is the creation of Chris, not the other way around. Few bookstores in Poland carried Amok, in part because of the novel's shocking content, and those which did placed it on the highest shelves, out of the reach of children. The book has not been translated into English. On the internet, a couple of reviewers praised Amok. "We haven't had this kind of book in Polish literature," one wrote, adding that it was paralyzingly realistic, totally vulgar, full of paranoid and delirious images. Another called it a masterpiece of illusion. Yet most readers considered the book, as one major Polish newspaper put it, to be without literary merit. Even one of Bala's friends dismissed it as rubbish. When Sieraka, the philosophy professor, opened it, she was stunned by its crude language, which was the antithesis of the straightforward, intelligent style of the papers that Bala had written at the university. "Frankly, I found the book hard to read," she says. An ex-girlfriend of Bala's later said, "I was shocked by the book, because he never used those words. He never acted obscenely or vulgar toward me. Our sex life was normal." Many of Bala's friends believed that he wanted to do in his fiction what he never did in life: shatter every taboo. In the interview that Bala gave after Amok was published, he said, "I wrote the book not caring about any convention. A simple reader will find interesting only a few violent scenes with a graphic description of people having sex. But if someone really looks, he will see that these scenes are intended to awaken the reader and show how fucked up and impoverished and hypocritical this world is. By Bala's own estimate, Amok sold only a couple of thousand copies. But he was confident that it would eventually find its place among the great works of literature. "I'm truly convinced that one day my book will be appreciated," he said. "History teaches that some works of art have to wait ages before they are recognized. In at least one respect, the book succeeded." Chris was so authentically creepy that it was hard not to believe that he was the product of a genuinely disturbed mind, and that he and the author were indeed indistinguishable. On Bala's website, readers described him and his work as grotesque, sexist, and psychopathic. During an internet conversation in June of 2003, a friend told Bala that his book did not give the reader a good impression of him. When Bala assured her that the book was fiction, she insisted that Chris's musings had to be your thoughts. Bala became irritated. "Only a fool," he said, "would believe that." Detective Wroblewski underlined various passages as he studied Amok. At first glance, few details of Mary's murder resembled the killing of Yanishevsky. Most conspicuously, the victim in the novel is a woman, and the killer's longtime friend. Moreover, although Mary has a noose around her neck, she gets stabbed with a Japanese knife and Yanishevsky wasn't. One detail in the book, however, chilled Wroblewski. After the murder, Chris says, "I sell the Japanese knife on an internet auction." The similarity to the selling of Yanishevsky's cell phone on the internet, a detail that the police had never released to the public, seemed too extraordinary to be a coincidence. At one point in Amok, Chris intimates that he has also killed a man. When one of his girlfriends doubts his endless mytho-creations, he says, "Which story didn't you believe? That my radio station went bankrupt, or that I killed a man who behaved inappropriately toward me 10 years ago? He adds of the murder, "Everyone considers it a fable. Maybe it's better that way. Fuck. Sometimes I don't believe it myself." Wroblewski had never read about postmodernism or language games. For him, facts were as indissoluble as bullets. You either killed someone or you didn't. His job was to piece together a logical chain of evidence that revealed the irrefutable truth. But Wroblewski also believed that, in order to catch a killer, you had to understand the social and psychological forces that had formed him. And so, if Bala had murdered Yanishevsky or participated in the crime, as Wroblewski now fully suspected, then Wroblewski, the empiricist, would have to become a postmodernist. To the surprise of members of his detective squad, Wroblewski made copies of the novel and handed them out. Everyone was assigned a chapter to interpret, to try to find any clues, any coded messages, any parallels with reality. Because Bala was living outside the country, Wroblewski warned his colleagues not to do anything that might alarm the author. Wroblewski knew that if Bala did not voluntarily return home to see his family, as he periodically did, it would be virtually impossible for the Polish police to apprehend him. At least for the moment, the police had to refrain from questioning Bala's family and friends. Instead, Wroblewski and his team combed public records and interrogated Bala's more distant associates, constructing a profile of the suspect, which they then compared with the profile of Chris in the novel. Wroblewski kept an unofficial scorecard. Both Bala and his literary creation were consumed by philosophy, had been abandoned by their wives, had a company go bankrupt, traveled around the world, and drank too much. Wroblewski discovered that Bala had once been detained by the police, and when he obtained the official report, it was as if he had already read it. As Bala's friend Powell, who was detained with him, later testified in court, "Christian came to me in the evening and had a bottle with him. We started drinking. Actually, we drank till dawn." Powell went on, "The alcohol ran out, so we went to a store to buy another bottle. As we were returning from the shop, we passed by a church. And this is when we had a very stupid idea." "What idea did you have?" the judge asked him. "We went into the church and we saw St. Anthony's figure, and we took it." "What for?" the judge inquired. "Well, we wanted a third person to drink with." Christian said afterward that we were crazy. In the novel, when the police catch Chris and his friend drinking beside the statue of St. Anthony, Chris says, "We were threatened by prison. I was speechless. I do not feel like a criminal, but I became one. I had done much worse things in my life, and never suffered any consequences. And don't think you're just going to flare your nostrils out of this one. Wroblewski began to describe Amok as a roadmap to a crime, but some authorities objected that he was pushing the investigation in a highly suspect direction. The police asked a criminal psychologist to analyze the character of Chris in order to gain insight into Bala. The psychologist wrote in her report, "The character of Chris is an egocentric man with great intellectual ambitions. He perceives himself as an intellectual with his own philosophy, based on his education and high IQ. His way of functioning shows features of psychopathic behavior. He is testing the limits to see if he can actually carry out his sadistic fantasies. He treats people with disrespect, considers them to be intellectually inferior to himself, uses manipulation to fulfill his own needs, and is determined to satiate his sexual desires in a hedonistic way. If such a character were real, a true living person, his personality could have been shaped by a highly unrealistic sense of his own worth. It could also be a result of psychological wounds and his insecurities as a man, pathological relationships with his parents, or unacceptable homosexual tendencies." The psychologist acknowledged the links between Bala and Chris, such as divorce and philosophical interests, but cautioned that such overlaps were common with novelists, and she warned, basing an analysis of the author on his fictional character would be a gross violation. Wroblewski knew that details in the novel did not qualify as evidence. They had to be corroborated independently. So far, though, he had only one piece of concrete evidence linking Bala to the victim: the cell phone. In February 2002, the Polish television program 997, which, like America's Most Wanted, solicits the public's help in solving crimes, 997 is the emergency telephone number in Poland, aired a segment devoted to Janishevsky's murder. Afterward, the show posted on its website the latest news about the progress of the investigation and asked for tips. Wroblewski and his men carefully analyzed the responses. Over the years, hundreds of people had visited the website from places as far away as Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Yet the police didn't turn up a single fruitful lead. When Wroblewski and the telecommunications expert checked to see if Bala had purchased or sold any other items on the internet while logged on as Chris B7, they made a curious discovery. On October 17, 2000, a month before Janishevsky was kidnapped, Bala had clicked on the Allegro auction site for a police manual called Accidental, Suicidal, or Criminal Hanging. Hanging a mature, conscious, healthy, and physically fit person is very difficult even for several people, the manual stated, and described various ways that a noose might be tied. Bala did not purchase the book on Allegro, and it was unclear if he obtained it elsewhere, but that he was seeking such information was, at least to Wroblewski, a sign of premeditation. Still, Wroblewski knew that if he wanted to convict Bala of murder, he would need more than the circumstantial evidence he had gathered. He would need a confession. Bala remained abroad, supporting himself by publishing articles in travel magazines, and by teaching English and scuba diving. In January of 2005, while visiting Micronesia, he sent an email to a friend, saying, "I'm writing this letter from paradise." Finally, that fall, Wroblewski learned that Bala was coming home. At approximately 2:30 p.m., after leaving a drugstore at Legnica Street in Chojno, "I was attacked by 3 men," Bala later wrote in a statement, describing what happened to him on September 5, 2005, shortly after he returned to his hometown. "One of them twisted my arms behind my back. Another squeezed my throat so that I could not speak and could barely breathe. Meanwhile, the third one handcuffed me." Bala said that his attackers were tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair, like skinheads. Without telling Bala who they were or what they wanted, they forced him into a dark green vehicle and slipped a black plastic bag over his head. "I couldn't see anything," Bala said. "They ordered me to lie face down on the floor." Bala said that his assailants continued to beat him, shouting, "You fucking prick! You motherfucker!" He pleaded with them to leave him alone and not hurt him. Then he heard one of the men say on a cell phone, "Hi, boss. We got the shithead. Yes, he's still alive. So now what?" At the meeting point, the man continued, "And what about the money? Will we get it today?" Bala said he thought that, because he lived abroad and was known to be a writer, the men assumed that he was wealthy and were seeking a ransom. I tried to explain to them that I didn't have money, Bala stated. The more he spoke, though, the more brutally they attacked him. Eventually, the car came to a stop, apparently in a wooded area. "We can dig a hole for this shit here and bury him," one of the men said. Bala struggled to breathe through the plastic bag. "I thought that this was going to be the last moment of my life, but suddenly they got back into the car and began driving again," he said. After a long time, the car came to another stop, and the men shoved him out of the car and into a building. "I didn't hear a door, but because there was no wind or sun, I assumed that we had entered," Bala said. "The men threatened to kill him if he didn't cooperate, then led him upstairs into a small room, where they stripped him, deprived him of food, beat him, and began to interrogate him. Only then," Bala said, "did he realize that he was in police custody and had been brought in for questioning by a man called Jack Sparrow." "None of it happened," Wroblewski later told me. "We used standard procedures and followed the letter of the law." According to Wroblewski and other officers, they apprehended Bala by the drugstore without violence and drove him to police headquarters in Wrocław. Wroblewski and Bala sat facing each other in the detective's cramped office. A light bulb overhead cast a faint glow, and Bala could see on the wall the goat horns that eerily resembled the image on the cover of his book. Bala appeared gentle and scholarly, yet Wroblewski recalled how, in Amok, Chris says, "It's easier for people to imagine that Christ can turn urine into beer than that someone like me can send to hell some asshole smashed into a lump of ground meat." Wroblewski initially circled around the subject of the murder, trying to elicit offhand information about Bala's business and his relationships, and concealing what the police already knew about the crime. An interrogator's chief advantage. When Wroblewski did confront him about the killing, Bala looked dumbfounded. "I didn't know Dariusz Janaszewski," he said. "I know nothing about the murder." Wroblewski pressed him about the curious details in Amok. Bala later told me it was insane. He treated the book as if it were my literal autobiography. He must have read the book 100 times. He knew it by heart. When Wroblewski mentioned several facts in the novel, such as the theft of the statue of St. Anthony, Bala acknowledged that he had drawn certain elements from his life. As Bala put it to me, "Sure, I'm guilty of that. Show me an author who doesn't do that." Wroblewski then played his trump card, the cell phone. How did Bala get hold of it? Bala said that he couldn't remember, it was 5 years ago. Then he said that he must have bought the phone at a pawn shop, as he had done several times in the past. He agreed to take a polygraph test. Wroblewski helped to prepare the questions for the examiner, who asked, "Just before Dariusz Janaszewski lost his life, did you know this would happen? Were you the one who killed him? Do you know who actually murdered him? Did you know Janaszewski? Were you in the place where Janaszewski was held hostage?" Bala replied no to each question. Periodically, he seemed to slow his breathing, in the manner of a scuba diver. The examiner wondered if he was trying to manipulate the test. On some questions, the examiner suspected Bala of lying, but, overall, the results were inconclusive. "Hi, I'm Todd, and I'll be your centerpiece tonight." In Poland, after a suspect is detained for 48 hours, the prosecutor in the case is required to present his evidence before a judge and charge the suspect. Otherwise, the police must release him. The case against Bala remained weak. All Wroblewski and the police had was the cell phone, which Bala could have obtained, as he claimed, from a pawn shop, the sketchy results of a polygraph, a notoriously unreliable test, a book on hanging that Bala might not even have purchased, and clues possibly embedded in a novel. Wroblewski had no motive or confession. As a result, the authorities charged Bala only with selling stolen property, Janaszewski's phone, and with paying a bribe in an unrelated business matter, which Wroblewski had uncovered during the course of his investigation. Wroblewski knew that neither charge would likely carry any jail time, and although Bala had to remain in the country and relinquish his passport, he was otherwise a free man. "I had spent 2 years trying to build a case, and I was watching it all collapse," Wroblewski recalled. Later, as he was flipping through Bala's passport, Wroblewski noticed stamps from Japan, South Korea, and the United States. He remembered that the website of the television show 997 had recorded page views from all of those countries. a fact that had baffled investigators. Why would anyone so far away be interested in a local Polish murder? Wróblewski compared the periods when Bala was in each country with the timing of the page views. The dates matched. Bala, meanwhile, was becoming a cause célèbre. As Wróblewski continued to investigate him for murder, Bala filed a formal grievance with the authorities, claiming that he had been kidnapped and tortured. When Bala told his friend Rosiński that he was being persecuted for his art, Rosiński was incredulous. "I figured that he was testing out some crazy idea for his next novel," he recalls. Soon after, Wróblewski questioned Rosiński about his friend. "That's when I realized that Christian was telling the truth," Rosiński says. Rosiński was shocked when Wróblewski began to grill him about Amok. "I told him that I recognized some details from real life, but that, to me, the book was a work of fiction," Rosiński says. "This was crazy. You cannot prosecute a man based on the novel he wrote." Beata Sierraka, Bala's former professor, who was also called in for questioning, says that she felt as if she were being interrogated by literary theorists. As outrage over the investigation mounted, one of Bala's girlfriends, Denise Reinhardt, set up a defense committee on his behalf. Reinhardt, an American theater director, met Bala while she was studying in Poland in 2001, and they had subsequently traveled together to the United States and South Korea. Reinhardt solicited support over the internet, writing, "Christian is the author of a fictional philosophical book called Amok. A lot of the language and content is strong, and there are several metaphors that might be considered against the Catholic Church and Polish tradition." During his brutal interrogation, they referenced his book numerous times, citing it as proof of his guilt. Dubbing the case the Sprawa absurd, the absurd matter, the committee contacted human rights organizations and international PN. Before long, the Polish Justice Ministry was deluged with letters on Bala's behalf from around the world. One said, "Mr. Bala deserves his rights in accordance with Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights that guarantees the right to freedom of expression. We urge you to ensure there is an immediate and thorough investigation into his kidnapping and imprisonment, and that all of those found responsible are brought to justice." Bala, writing in imperfect English, sent out frantic bulletins to the Defense Committee, which published them in a newsletter. In a bulletin on September 13, 2005, Bala warned that he was being spied on and said, "I want you to know that I will fight until the end." The next day, he said of Wróblewski and the police, "They have ruined my family life. We will never talk loud at home again. We will never use internet freely again. We will never make any phone calls not thinking about who is listening. My mother takes some pills to stay calm. Otherwise she would get insane because of this absurd accusation. My old father smokes 50 cigs a day and I smoke 3 packs. We all sleep 3 to 4 hours daily and we are afraid of leaving a house. Every single bark of our little dog alerts us and we don't know what or who to expect. It's a terror, quiet terror." The Polish authorities, meanwhile, had launched an internal investigation into Bala's allegations of mistreatment. In early 2006, after months of probing, the investigators declared that they had found no corroborating evidence. In this instance, they insisted Bala's tale was indeed a mythocreation. "I have infected you," Chris warns the reader at the beginning of Amok. "You will not be able to get free of me." Wróblewski remained haunted by one riddle in the novel, which, he believed, was crucial to solving the case. A character asks Chris, "Who was the one-eyed man among the blind?" The phrase derives from Erasmus, 1469 to 1536, the Dutch theologian and classical scholar, who said, "In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Who in Amok, Wróblewski wondered, was the one-eyed man, and who were the blind men? In the novel's last line, Chris suddenly claims that he has solved the riddle, explaining, "This was the one killed by blind jealousy." But the sentence, with its strange lack of context, made little sense. One hypothesis based on Amok was that Bala had murdered Janiszewski after beginning a homosexual affair with him. In the novel, after Chris's closest friend confesses that he is gay, Chris says that part of him wanted to strangle him with a rope and chop a hole in a frozen river and dump him there. Still, the theory seemed dubious. Wróblewski had thoroughly investigated Janiszewski's background, and there was no indication that he was gay. Another theory was that the murder was the culmination of Bala's twisted philosophy, that he was a postmodern version of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, the two brilliant Chicago students who, in the 1920s, were so entranced by Nietzsche's ideas that they killed a 14-year-old boy to see if they could execute the perfect murder and become supermen. At their trial, in which they received life sentences, Clarence Darrow, the legendary defense attorney who represented them, said of Leopold, "Here is a boy at 16 or 17 becoming obsessed with these doctrines. It was not a casual bit of philosophy with him. It was his life." Darrow, trying to save the boys from the death penalty, concluded, "Is there any blame attached because somebody took Nietzsche's philosophy seriously and fashioned his life upon it? It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." In Amok, Chris clearly aspires to be a postmodern Übermensch, speaking of his will to power and insisting that anyone who is unable to kill should not stay alive. Yet these sentiments did not fully explain the murder of the unknown man in the novel, who, Chris says, had behaved inappropriately toward him. Chris, alluding to what happened between them, says teasingly, maybe he didn't do anything significant. But the most vicious devil is in the details. If Bala's philosophy had justified, in his mind, a break from moral constraints, including the prohibition on murder, these passages suggested that there was still another motive, a deep personal connection to the victim, something that the brutality of the crime also indicated. With Bala unable to leave Poland, Wróblewski and his team began to question the suspect's closest friends and family. Many of those interrogated saw Bala positively. "A bright, interesting man," one of his former girlfriends said of him. Bala had recently received a reference from a past employer at an English instruction school in Poland, which described him as intelligent, inquisitive, and easy to get along with, and praised his keen sense of humor. The reference concluded, with no reservation, "I highly recommend Christian Bala for any teaching position with children." Yet, as Wróblewski and his men deepened their search for the devil in the details, a darker picture of Bala's life began to emerge. The years 1999 and 2000, during which time his business and his marriage collapsed, and Yanishevsky was murdered, had been especially troubled. A friend recalled that Bala once started to behave vulgarly and wanted to take his clothes off and show his manliness. The family babysitter described him as increasingly drunk and out of control. She said he constantly berated his wife, Stasia, shouting at her that she slept around and cheated on him. According to several people, after Bala and his wife separated, in 2000, he remained possessive of her. A friend, who called Bala an authoritarian type, said of him, he continuously controlled Stasia and checked her phones. At a New Year's Eve party in 2000, just weeks after Yanishevsky's body was found, Bala thought a bartender was making advances toward his wife and, as one witness put it, went crazy. Bala screamed that he would take care of the bartender and that he had already dealt with such a guy. At the time, Stasia and her friends had dismissed his drunken outburst. Even so, it took 5 people to restrain Bala. As one of them told police, he was running amok. As Wróblewski and his men were trying to fix on a motive, other members of the squad stepped up their efforts to trace the 2 suspicious telephone calls that had been made to Yanishevsky's office and to his cell phone on the day he disappeared. The public telephone from which both calls were made was operated with a card. Each card was embedded with a unique number that registered with the phone company whenever it was used. Not long after Bala was released, the telecommunications expert on the Yanishevsky case was able to determine the number on the caller's card. Once the police had that information, officials could trace all the telephone numbers dialed with that same card. Over a 3-month period, 32 calls had been made. They included calls to Bala's parents, his girlfriend, his friends, and a business associate. The truth was becoming clearer and clearer, Wróblewski said. Wróblewski and his team soon uncovered another connection between the victim and the suspect. Małgorzata Drozdal, a friend of Stasia's, told the police that in the summer of 2000 she had gone with Stasia to a nightclub called Crazy Horse in Wrocław. While Drozdal was dancing, she saw Stasia talking to a man with long hair and bright blue eyes. She recognized him from around town. His name was Dariusz Yanishevsky. Wróblewski had one last person to question, Stasia, but she had steadfastly refused to cooperate. Perhaps she was afraid of her ex-husband. Perhaps she believed Bala's claim that he was being persecuted by the police. Or perhaps she dreaded the idea of one day telling her son that she had betrayed his father. Wroblewski and his men approached Stasia again, this time showing her sections of Amok, which was published after she and Bala had split up, and which she had never looked at closely. According to Polish authorities, Stasia examined passages involving Chris's wife, Sonia, and was so disturbed by the character similarities to her that she finally agreed to talk. She confirmed that she had met Yanishevsky at Crazy Horse. I had ordered French fries, and I asked a man next to the bar whether the French fries were ready, Stasia recalled. That man was Dariush. They spent the entire night talking, she said, and Yanishevsky gave her his phone number. Later, they went on a date and checked into a motel. But before anything happened, she said, Yanishevsky admitted that he was married, and she left. Since I know what it's like to be a wife whose husband betrays her, I didn't want to do that to another woman, Stasia said. The difficulties in Yanishevsky's marriage soon ended, and he and Stasia never went out together again. Several weeks after her date with Yanishevsky, Stasia said, Bala showed up at her place in a drunken fury, demanding that she admit to having an affair with Yanishevsky. He broke down the front door and struck her. He shouted that he had hired a private detective and knew everything. He also mentioned that he had visited Dariush's office and described it to me, Stasia recalled. Then he said he knew which hotel we went to and what room we were in. Later, when she learned that Yanishevsky had disappeared, Stasia said, she asked Bala if he had anything to do with it, and he said no. She did not pursue the matter, believing that Bala, for all his tumultuous behavior, was incapable of murder. For the first time, Wroblewski thought he understood the last line of Amok. This was the one killed by blind jealousy. Spectators flooded into the courtroom in Wrocław on February 22, 2007, the first day of Bala's trial. There were philosophers who argued with each other over the consequences of postmodernism. Young lawyers who wanted to learn about the police department's new investigative techniques, and reporters who chronicled every tantalizing detail. Killing doesn't make much of an impression in the 21st century, but allegedly killing and then writing about it in a novel is front-page news. A front-page article in Angora, a weekly based in Lodz, declared. The judge, Lydia Hojenska, sat at the head of the courtroom, beneath an emblem of the white Polish eagle. In accordance with Polish law, the presiding judge, along with another judge and 3 citizens, acted as the jury. The defense and the prosecution sat at 2 unadorned wooden tables. Next to the prosecutors were Yanishevsky's widow and his parents, his mother holding a picture of her son. The public congregated in the back of the room, and in the last row was a stout, nervous woman with short red hair, who looked as if her own life were at stake. It was Bala's mother, Teresa. His father was too distraught to attend. Everyone's attention, it seemed, was directed toward a zoo-like cage near the center of the courtroom. It was almost 9 feet high and 20 feet long, and had thick metal bars. Standing in the middle of it, wearing a suit and peering out calmly through his spectacles, was Christian Bala. He faced up to 25 years in prison. A trial is predicated on the idea that truth is obtainable. Yet it is also, as the writer Janet Malcolm has noted, a struggle between 2 competing narratives, and the story that can best withstand the attrition of the rules of evidence is the story that wins. In this case, the prosecution's narrative resembled that of Amok. Bala, like his alter ego Chris, was a depraved hedonist who, unbound by any sense of moral compunction, had murdered someone in a fit of jealous rage. The prosecution introduced files from Bala's computer, which Wroblewski and the police had seized during a raid of his parents' house. In one file, which had to be accessed with the password Amok, Bala cataloged in graphic detail sexual encounters with more than 70 women. The list included his wife, Stasia, a divorced cousin, who was older and plump, the mother of a friend, described as old-ass, hardcore action, and a Russian whore in an old car. The prosecution also presented emails in which Bala sounded unmistakably like Chris, using the same vulgar or arcane words, such as joy juices and Madame Melancholy. In an angry email to Stasia, Bala wrote, "Life is not only screwing, darling," which echoed Chris's exclamation, Fucking is not the end of the world, Mary. A psychologist testified that every author puts some part of his personality into his artistic creation, and that Chris and the defendant shared sadistic qualities. Technically, my bachelorhood isn't so much confirmed as it is legislated. During all this, Bala sat in the cage, taking notes on the proceedings or looking curiously out at the crowd. At times, he seemed to call into question the premise that the truth can be discerned. Under Polish law, the defendant can ask questions directly of the witnesses, and Bala eagerly did so, his professorial inquiries often phrased to reveal the Derridean instability of their testimony. When a former girlfriend testified that Bala once went out on her balcony drunk and acted as if he were on the verge of committing suicide, he asked her if her words might have multiple interpretations. Could we just say that this is a matter of semantics, a misuse of the word suicide? He said. But, as the trial wore on and the evidence mounted against him, the postmodernist sounded increasingly like an empiricist, a man desperately looking to show gaps in the prosecution's chain of evidence. Bala noted that no one had seen him kidnap Yanishevsky, or kill him, or dump his body. I'd like to say that I never met Dariush, and there is not a single witness who would confirm that I did so, Bala said. He complained that the prosecution was taking random incidents in his personal life and weaving them into a story that no longer resembled reality. The prosecutors were constructing a mythocreation or, as Bala's defense attorney put it to me, the plot of a novel. According to the defense, the police and the media had been seduced by the most alluring story rather than by the truth. Bala had long subscribed to the postmodernist notion of the death of the author, that an author has no more access to the meaning of his literary work than anyone else. Yet, as the prosecution presented to the jury potentially incriminating details from Amok, Bala complained that his novel was being misinterpreted. He insisted that the murder of Mary was simply a symbol of the destruction of philosophy, and he made one last attempt to assert authorial control. As he later put it to me, "I'm the fucking author. I know what I meant." In early September, the case went to the jury. Bala never took the stand, but in a statement he said, "I do believe the court will make the right decision and absolve me of all the charges." Wroblewski, who had been promoted to inspector, showed up in court, hoping to hear the verdict. "Even when you're sure of the facts, you wonder if someone else will see them the same way you do," he told me. At last, the judges and jurors filed back into the courtroom. Bala's mother waited anxiously. She had never read Amok, which contains a scene of Chris fantasizing about raping his mother. "I started to read the book, but it was too hard," she told me. "If someone else had written the book, maybe I would have read it, but I'm his mother." Bala's father appeared in the courtroom for the first time. He had read the novel, and though he had trouble understanding parts of it, he thought it was an important work of literature. "You can read it 10, 20 times, and each time discover something new in it," he said. On his copy, Bala had written an inscription to both his parents. It said, "Thank you for your forgiveness of all my sins." As Judge Hojenska read the verdict, Bala stood perfectly straight and still. Then came the one unmistakable word, guilty. The gray cinderblock prison in Wrocław looks like a relic of the Soviet era. After I slipped my visitors past through a tiny hole in the wall, a disembodied voice ordered me to the front of the building, where a solid gate swung open and a guard emerged, blinking in the sunlight. The guard waved me inside as the gate slammed shut behind us. After being searched, I was led through several dank interlocking chambers and into a small visitor's room with dingy wooden tables and chairs. Conditions in Polish prisons are notorious. Because of overcrowding, as many as 7 people are often kept in a single cell. In 2004, prison inmates in Wrocław staged a 3-day hunger strike to protest overcrowding, poor food, and insufficient medical care. Violence is also a problem. Only a few days before I arrived, I was told a visitor had been stabbed to death by an inmate. In the corner of the visitor's room was a slender, handsome man with wire-rimmed glasses and a navy blue artist's smock over a t-shirt that said University of Wisconsin. He was holding a book and looked like an American student abroad, and it took me a moment to realize that I was staring at Christian Bala. "I'm glad you could come," he said as he shook my hand, leading me to one of the tables. "This whole thing is farce. like something out of Kafka. He spoke clear English but with a heavy accent, so that his ses sounded like zs. Sitting down, he leaned across the table, and I could see that his cheeks were drawn. He had dark circles around his eyes, and his curly hair was standing up in front, as if he had been anxiously running his fingers through it. I am being sentenced to prison for 25 years for writing a book. A book, he said. It is ridiculous. It is bullshit. Excuse my language, but that is what it is. Look, I wrote a novel, a crazy novel. Is the book vulgar? Yes. Is it obscene? Yes. Is it bawdy? Yes. Is it offensive? Yes. I intended it to be. This was a work of provocation. He paused, searching for an example, then added, I wrote, for instance, that it would be easier for Christ to come out of a woman's womb than for me. He stopped, catching himself. I mean, for the narrator to fuck her. You see, this is supposed to offend. He went on, what is happening to me is like what happened to Salman Rushdie. As he spoke, he placed the book that he was carrying on the table. It was a worn, battered copy of Amok. When I asked Bala about the evidence against him, such as the cell phone and the calling card, he sounded evasive and, at times, conspiratorial. The calling card is not mine, he said. Someone is trying to set me up. I don't know who yet, but someone is out to destroy me. His hand touched mine. Don't you see what they are doing? They are constructing this reality and forcing me to live inside it. He said that he had filed an appeal, which cited logical and factual inconsistencies in the trial. For instance, one medical examiner said that Yanishevsky had drowned, whereas another insisted that he had died of strangulation. The judge herself had admitted that she was not sure if Bala had carried out the crime alone or with an accomplice. When I asked him about Amok, Bala became animated and gave direct and detailed answers. The thesis of the book is not my personal thesis, he said. I'm not an anti-feminist. I'm not a chauvinist. I'm not heartless. Chris, in many places, is my antihero. Several times, he pointed to my pad and said, put this down, or this is important. As he watched me taking notes, he said, with a hint of awe, you see how crazy this is? You are here writing a story about a story I made up about a murder that never happened. On virtually every page of his copy of Amok, he had underlined passages and scribbled notations in the margins. Later, he showed me several scraps of paper on which he had drawn elaborate diagrams revealing his literary influences. It was clear that, in prison, he had become even more consumed by the book. I sometimes read pages aloud to my cellmates, he said. Excuse me, do you have a minute for someone other than yourself, you selfish bastard? One question that was never answered at the trial still hovered over the case. Why would someone commit a murder and then write about it in a novel that would help to get him caught? In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov speculates that even the smartest criminal makes mistakes, because he experiences at the moment of the crime a sort of failure of will and reason, which are replaced by a phenomenal, childish thoughtlessness, just at the moment when reason and prudence are most necessary. Amok, however, had been published 3 years after the murder. If Bala was guilty of murder, the cause was not a failure of will and reason, but rather an excess of both. Some observers wondered if Bala had wanted to get caught, or at least to unburden himself. In Amok, Chris speaks of having a guilty conscience, and of his desire to remove his white gloves of silence. Though Bala maintained his innocence, it was possible to read the novel as a kind of confession. Wroblewski and the authorities, who believed that Bala's greatest desire was to attain literary immortality, saw his crime and his writing as indivisible. At the trial, Yanishevsky's widow pleaded with the press to stop making Bala out to be an artist rather than a murderer. Since his arrest, Amok had become a sensation in Poland, selling out at virtually every bookstore. There's going to be a new edition coming out with an afterword about the trial and all the events that have happened, Bala told me excitedly. Other countries are interested in publishing it as well. Flipping through the pages of his own copy, he added, there's never been a book quite like this. As we spoke, he seemed far less interested in the idea of the perfect crime than he was in the perfect story, which, in his definition, pushed past the boundaries of aesthetics and reality and morality charted by his literary forebears. You know, I'm working on a sequel to Amok, he said, his eyes lighting up. It's called Deliric. He repeated the words several times. It's a pun. It means lyrics, as in a story or delirium. He explained that he had started the new book before he was arrested, but that the police had seized his computer, which contained his only copy. He was trying to get the files back. The authorities told me that they had found in the computer evidence that Bala was collecting information on Stasia's new boyfriend, Harry. Single, 34 years old. His mom died when he was 8, Bala had written. Apparently works at the railway company, probably as a train driver, but I'm not sure. Wroblewski and the authorities suspected that Harry might be Bala's next target. After Bala had learned that Harry visited an internet chat room, he had posted a message at the site, under an assumed name, saying, "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Harry. Does anyone know him from Chajno?" Bala told me that he hoped to complete his second novel after the appeals court made its ruling. In fact, several weeks after we spoke, the court, to the disbelief of many, annulled the original verdict. Although the appeals panel found an undoubted connection between Bala and the murder, it concluded that there were still gaps in the logical chain of evidence, such as the medical examiner's conflicting testimony, which needed to be resolved. The panel refused to release Bala from prison, but ordered a new trial, which is scheduled to begin this spring. Bala insisted that, no matter what happened, he would finish the lyric. He glanced at the guards, as if afraid they might hear him, then leaned forward and whispered, "This book is going to be even more shocking." Published in the print edition of the February 11th and 18, 2008 issue, with the headline True Crime. David Gran, a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2003, is the author of, most recently, The Wager and of Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI, which won an Edgar Award and was a finalist for the National Book Award.